The ranking member is recognized.
You know, we've talked several times about the rules, and we can disagree. We're Democrats and Republicans. But I call your attention to House rules that you referenced my comments that they were despicable. That's against House rules.
Actually, calling you despicable would be against House rules. Calling your words despicable are not. I can even say it's dishonest what you said. I can't say you're a liar. It's very clear, and I've made that distinction before, actually gaveling down comments made by a Republican. She actually, in that case, called the secretary a liar. She didn't say, others have said that those words are dishonest or that's a lie. You can say that. You can't say the individual is a liar. Your words were despicable.
Well,
I didn't say anything about you personally.
Well, then I'm clear, as long as you didn't make Benny Thompson.
Yeah, I would never say that about an individual sitting in this committee. But I was very disappointed with your accusation that I would use these individuals as political pawns.
Mr. Chairman, your disappointment is fine. But one of the tenets of who we are as a democracy is that I have an opinion, and you have an opinion, and let's respect that. And so as long as you understand that we don't have to, we can disagree on the words, I was just trying to get clarification about that. And since you say you wasn't talking about me specifically, then I'm fine. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The committee stands. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Before we begin today's hearing, I want to address misinformation my Republican colleagues are spreading, falsely alleging that Secretary Mayorkas is refusing to testify before this committee. Let me set the record straight. Secretary Mayorkas has testified before Congress more than any other cabinet secretary. He's appeared before this committee twice in the last year, including just 2 months ago when he testified for several hours about border security. His willingness to work with the committee has been a welcome change from the Trump administration, whose officials consistently refused to comply with congressional oversight. They ignored virtually every oversight letter and even defied a subpoena for their so-called acting secretary to appear before the committee. Secretary Mayorkas, however, has been forthright in dealing with Congress. In response to the chairman's request to testify at today's hearing on January 11th, 2024, the secretary sent a letter agreeing to make himself available to testify at a future mutually agreed upon date. However, the chairman has refused to accept. Instead, Republicans sent angry letters and tweets accusing the secretary of refusing to testify, knowing full well he said he would appear. Republicans are acting in bad faith. Unfortunately, that's nothing new. Months ago, Chairman Green promised donors at a campaign event that he'd bring an impeachment case against Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. He told his contributors to, quote, get the popcorn, and promised it's going to be fun, unquote. Before the committee had even begun its inquiry, Republicans had predetermined the outcome. But why did Republicans invite the secretary to testify only to refuse his offer to appear? The answer to that question appeared in the Hill newspaper last night. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record this article from the Hill describing how Republicans had set the date for the markup of articles of impeachment before holding the first hearing on this subject.
Without objection, so ordered.
According to an internal Republican memo dated January 10, 2024, Republicans had already scheduled a committee vote to impeach the secretary prior to holding a single impeachment hearing. Just as we've said all along, the outcome of Republicans' so-called impeachment investigation has been predetermined from the start. The chairman promised to follow the facts, but Republicans never really intended to do so. They are hurrying to adhere to an artificial timeline agreed in a backroom deal between Republican leadership, who's holding on by a thread, and its most extreme mega members. This isn't a real impeachment. It's a mega spectacle paid for by American tax dollars for Republican political gain. But through it all, Secretary Mayorkas remained committed to doing his job. The Department of Homeland Security's mission and the men and women who served with him at DHS. The Secretary is also committed to work diligently on a bipartisan basis to secure necessary funding for border security and to prepare the department for a possible shutdown. I wish my Republican colleagues would engage the Secretary to provide the department the funding it needs, but they have refused. I look forward to continuing to work with Secretary Mayorkas on critical Homeland Security issues facing the country and commend him for his unwavering commitment to duty even in the face of this sham impeachment. I also note for the record that when I asked at last week's hearing about providing the Secretary due process during the committee's impeachment proceedings, the chairman gave no substantive answers to my repeated inquiries. In fact, he seemed to have even considered providing the Secretary due process and appeared unprepared to respond. This is unfortunate, but not surprising. Again, this isn't a real impeachment. It's a predetermined, pre-planned partisan political stunt. Yesterday, the chairman threatened to hold Secretary Mayorkas in contempt for failing to appear before the committee, even though the Secretary has already agreed to appear. That's not how contempt works. I can't help but wonder if Republicans are getting a bit desperate, especially after their hearing last week was a flop. It fell flat after their witnesses, 3 Republican politicians, rehashed old partisan talking points without so much as a shred of evidence to support their politically motivated claims for impeachment. The Democratic witness, respected impeachment expert and constitutional scholar, Professor Frank Bowman, testified, and I quote, "Policy differences, no matter how severe, no matter how heated, are simply not grounds for impeachment," unquote. You cannot impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like a president's policies. That's not what impeachment is for. That's not what the Constitution says. Unfortunately, Republicans are willing to damage the Constitution they claim to hold dear because they think it will benefit them politically. Which brings us to today's hearing. I want to begin by expressing my deepest sympathies to Mrs. Noble and Mrs. Dunn on the tragic loss of your children. I cannot fathom your pain. As a father and a grandfather, my heart truly goes out to you. Indeed, our hearts go out to all those who've lost loved ones to drugs and violence, and we are committed to helping prevent future tragedies. Democrats want to strengthen border security. We want to keep fentanyl off our streets. We want to keep communities safe. We want to help those struggling with addiction. But impeachment will not do any of that. The fact is, impeachment is a waste of precious time that could be used to legislate on the urgent issues if only Republicans were willing to do. The Democratic witness today, Professor Deborah Pearlstein, is a constitutional law scholar, but in addition to her knowledge of impeachment, she's great expertise on the awesome power vested in Congress by the Constitution to effect change for the American people. That power is not through impeachment. As Professor Pearlstein stated in her testimony, and I quote, "Impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas can have no impact on the administration's exercise of immigration enforcement discretion, a power the Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized is vested by the Constitution in the executive branch, unquote. Instead, Congress' power comes from its ability to legislate. As Professor Pearlstein goes on to say, quote, no branch of government has more power under our Constitution to address matters of border security than Congress, unquote. In other words, it's up to Congress to provide funding to interdict fentanyl, fix our broken immigration system, and provide help for those suffering from opioid addiction. That's our role in this, to use the power provided under the Constitution to legislate on important issues to help people who need it most, and not some baseless, senseless impeachment. I look forward to hearing from Professor Pearlstein about Congress's power to make meaningful progress on these and other issues. Mr. Chairman, I made this plea to you last week. It fell on deaf ears, but I'll try again. Let's drop this baseless impeachment and get back to doing the real work of securing the homeland and helping people across this great country. Before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry. I'd like to give you another chance at this one.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, during our hearing last week, you said, quote, the committee will follow the rules of the House, end quote, with regard to Secretary Mayorkas' due process. What provisions of House Rule 11 grants the Secretary representation before this committee?
Just a question of clarification on the parliamentary proceeding. What rule are you citing?
Rule 11.
Rule 11. The Secretary is not appearing before the committee today, so his counsel is not necessary.
Mr. Chairman, we all know that Secretary Mayorkas has been willing to appear before this committee. He's not running from anything. He's been to the Capitol Hill 27 times since he was sworn in. My question is about due process, and there's nothing in the standing House rules that protects the Secretary's rights. So, Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2J1 of Rule 11, I'm furnishing you with a demand for a Minority Day hearing on this subject, signed by all the Democratic members of this committee.
So the demand is not proper. You have a witness present, so. Before, right?
Yeah, this is the unanimous consent that include in the record the article, but also I have this request for the.
You want this included in the record? Is that what you're asking?
Well, that's a request for a Minority Day for the committee.
Okay. So as I understand the rules, the request is only in order when you don't have a witness present, and today you have a witness present, so this is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a parliamentary inquiry on that?
Yeah.
Is this an impeachment inquiry?
You want to read the request? Yeah, this is actually a hearing, not an inquiry.
Is this part of an impeachment investigation?
This is an impeachment hearing.
Okay. Under impeachment precedent, separate and apart from this particular hearing, the minority is allowed to have a hearing of its own choice and its own witnesses. That has happened in every single impeachment in history. If this is going to be an impeachment process, then there have to be rights and due process afforded to the individual who is being impeached. And part of that, historically, under historic precedent, is that there is a minority day with minority-determined witnesses, not a minority witness who's added to a hearing that the majority determines.
So I want to make clear this supposed misinformation about the request to Secretary Mayorkas. There have been multiple requests, 4 in fact, of me to ask him to come and be a part of this. And he has, to the press, said yes, to me, not provided any dates, and at some date in the future. You can't, that's stonewalling. And so at some point after 4, I finally said, I guess it was Monday, well, just send us a testimony in writing. So far, we haven't seen that either. The effort to give Secretary Mayorkas an opportunity to come before the committee in this context has been made many times. I appreciate that the ranking member pointed out that he has been in front of our committee, but that was mandated by, the threats briefing. That's what he came for, was the threats briefing, not a part of this investigation on the southwest border. Every time we've invited him, he has refused to give us a date to come. So he's been afforded an opportunity to come.
I understand that, and that's a separate issue, whether or not Mr. Mayorkas wants to take part in his own impeachment inquiry. But the question for you is that as part of the House impeachment process, there must be afforded to the minority a hearing that the minority gets to determine, because it's an impeachment process. It is not a normal oversight investigation. What Secretary Mayorkas wants to do is a separate matter. I understand your view, and I understand the ranking member has a different view. I'm sure we will get all of the different letters in the record, and I have an article here saying that the DHS letter contradicts the GOP claim that Mayorkas refused to testify, which I could enter by unanimous consent. But we're just talking right now about the impeachment process, and in this committee, where it has never been done before, it's normally in the Judiciary Committee, that there has to be a minority day with minority-determined witnesses.
I appreciate the letter, and we'll take it into consideration. And Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized for the remainder of your opening.
Well, let me ask unanimous consent that be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
So, Mr. Chairman, Rule 11 does not mention anything about having a minority witness at any given hearing. It only provides for a minority day. I refer the chair to page 599 of the House Rules Manual.
Were you asking a question, Mr. Ranking Member?
Yes, I mean, we didn't ask about a witness, we asked for a date.
Yes, I saw the letter. We've entered it into the record, and we want to continue with this hearing. We'll address that later.
No. Well, Mr. Chairman, this committee cannot proceed to any markup. I know you have long planned in which you committed to the speaker and to a member of this committee behind closed doors without a full hearing of the merits of impeachment. But a minority day on an impeachment is allowed by the rules.
Thank you.
And so we're just trying to.
No, I appreciate you
Do
mentioning.
you plan to honor that?
We're going to take it into consideration, and I'll meet with you later to talk about it.
Well,
I mean, do you have any other comments for your opening remarks?
It's a simple request. It's in the rules, and we just want the rules to be followed.
There's an interpretation disagreement on this. Our parliamentarian says that you're entitled to witnesses and not a specific hearing. We'll take a look at it after this, and you and I can talk about it then.
Mr. Ranking Member, will you yield for a question? I just want to make sure, because I don't think it was entered into the record before. The Ranking Member referred to the letter that counsel that Secretary Mayorkas sent
Yeah,
to the committee on January 11th.
If I could, Mr. Magaziner, this is his opening statement, not his 5 minutes. He can yield time to you in his 5 minutes.
Okay, I was just going to ask unanimous consent that the letter be entered into the record, but
I'm fine with that. We'll break protocol here just a second. If there's no objection, so ordered. Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized still. This gentlelady from Nevada for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, offer my deepest sympathy to the witnesses for their loss. Professor, you're the only expert in here on this topic. Would you say one more time for the record if the Constitution covers what Mr. Crane called dereliction of his oath, or any of the things that are being addressed here in terms of grounds for impeachment?
I don't believe the record supports grounds for impeachment here, no.
And are you in the mainstream of other constitutional scholars who have taken this position, written letters to the Post, written letters to our chairman, been public about this impeachment?
I signed a letter that was, in addition to another dozen or more bipartisan set of constitutional law scholars who took the same position.
And I want to emphasize that was a bipartisan list of scholars who are very versed in this topic and who know it better than any of us sitting up here. So it was interesting to me that when I heard Ms. Green and her tirade against you saying, we're not talking about the Constitution. She actually had the gall to say, we're not talking about the Constitution. And she's the one who entered the resolution that we are considering. So if we're not talking about the Constitution, what are we talking about? Well, we're wasting our breath talking about history, talking about precedent, talking about previous cases, talking about the language of the Constitution, talking about the original intent of the Constitution, because obviously the people on that side of the room are not talking about the Constitution. So they are throwing out 200 years of precedent. They're ignoring the interpretation of all these constitutional scholars. They're disregarding some of the comments that have been made by members of their own party about the folly of this resolution and this pursuit. So if we're not talking about the Constitution, then what are we talking about? It's a political stunt. It's an attempt to distract from a do-nothing Congress that's done nothing, and even less compared to the do-nothing Congress so named by Truman. And, I see another quote that I think is relevant. It was by the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Mr. Post, who they brought up to impeach in 1920. And by the way, it's only been done one time over 100 years ago, but they tried it in 1920. And his response was, it was mental dullness at high tension. I believe we've seen a lot of evidence today of mental dullness at high tension, with raised voices, with misinformation, with accusations, with demeaning comments. That was mental dullness at high tension. So if we're not talking about the Constitution, we're just trying to use some constitutional terms to pretend like stump the professor. We know more than they do. I would say that my colleagues across the aisle are simply just trying to put lipstick on a pig. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the ranking member to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Since its formation in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Committee on Homeland Security has distinguished itself through serious legislative and oversight work under the leadership of both parties. Republicans' partisan rush to consider House Resolution 863 today is a betrayal of that hard-earned record. This is a terrible day for the committee, the United States Constitution, and our great country. Republican members of Congress sworn to support and defend the Constitution are rejecting the framers' clear intent and over 2 centuries of precedent in favor of a sham impeachment. Republicans have failed to make a constitutionally viable case to impeach Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, a dedicated public servant. The sham impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas is a baseless political stunt by extreme MAGA Republicans. Chairman Green, Representative Margaret Taylor Greene, and others have pushed for and even fundraised based on this pre-planned, predetermined scapegoating of the Secretary. In a process akin to throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, Republicans have cooked up vague, unprecedented grounds to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, refusal to follow the law, and a breach of public trust. Neither of the impeachment charges the committee will consider today are a high crime and misdemeanor under Article 2 of the Constitution. No serious person believes they are. Refusal to follow the law or maladministration was deliberately rejected by the framers as grounds for impeachment. Indeed, no official in American history has ever been convicted after impeachment for refusal to follow the law. These disputes are settled in the court system, not through impeachment. Apparently, Republicans are upset they lost in court and are trying to relitigate their cases through impeachment. The Constitution does not allow that. Breach of public trust requires conduct intended to serve an official's own benefit or the benefit of a foreign power. No serious person can allege that Secretary Mayorkas' action meet the standard for breach of public trust under the Constitution. Nevertheless, throughout this truncated impeachment process, Republicans have ignored the facts and misrepresented the law to justify their scheme. But the law is clear, and so is Secretary's record. He's leveraged the full range of authorities at his disposal while stretching the resources provided by Congress to secure the border. He has removed record levels of migrants detained by more people than Congress has provided funding for, and prevented record levels of fentanyl from entering our communities. Constitutional law experts agree the Secretary has not committed any impeachable offense. Rather, he has faithfully implemented the administration's border policies Republicans apparently disagree with. But policy differences are not impeachable. House Republicans' impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas accomplishes nothing, which would be consistent with their abysmal record this Congress. At a hearing before the committee this month, constitutional scholar Professor Deborah Pearlstein said, quote, "No branch of government has more power under our Constitution to address matters of border security than Congress," unquote. At every opportunity, Republicans have turned their backs on legislation to provide resources to the Department of Homeland Security. In doing so, they are turning their backs on border agents and officers. If House Republicans were serious about improving conditions along the border, they would provide the department the funding necessary to do so. They have not. If House Republicans were serious about improving conditions at the border, they would negotiate border security legislation with the White House and the Senate. They have not. Instead, they sat on their hands as a bipartisan group of senators worked with the Biden administration to hammer out a deal. The extreme MAGA Republicans who are running the House of Representatives are deeply unserious people. They don't want progress. They don't want solutions. They want a political issue. And most of all, they want to please their disgraced former president. House Republicans take their marching orders from Donald Trump, who has directed them to reject a bipartisan border bill and urge Republican governors to defy a United States Supreme Court order ensuring the Border Patrol can do its job, including members of this committee also. The impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas is designed to distract the public from the fact that Republicans have ceded their power to Donald Trump. When Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, they had an opportunity to work with the White House and the Senate to move the country forward. Instead, they have been consumed by petty infighting during multiple speaker contests, unenforced crisis over government shutdowns, and futile political exercises like impeachment to satisfy the extreme MAGA base. The MAGA-led impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas is a baseless sham. And the few rational Republicans left in the House know that, even if they refuse to admit it. The American people deserve better. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record the Democratic report on this so-called impeachment.
Without objection, so ordered.
I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a letter dated today from Secretary Mayorkas to you, Chairman Green, detailing the actions the department has taken to secure the border and be responsive to Congress.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, history will judge what Republicans are doing here today, and it won't be favorably. This impeachment scheme is a dangerous attempt by House Republicans to distort the Constitution and the Secretary's record to cover up their inability and unwillingness to work with Democrats for the betterment of our constituents. Our service to this country demands that we be passionate in our beliefs and practical in our actions. The strength of our nation is rooted in our commitment to democratic principles and our willingness to set partisan differences aside to protect them. There are few better examples than former Republican Secretary Michael Chertoff, who cautioned this week that impeaching Secretary Mayorkas over policy differences would damage the Constitution. He wisely observed, quote, "Our nation is at its best when our leaders work together to confront the seemingly intractable. The situation at our border and our national security demand such bipartisan collaboration," unquote. He went on to say, quote, "Despite our different parties, I know Mr. Mayorkas to be fair and honest, dedicated to the safety and security of the United States. He has represented DHS to the country and to both parties in Congress with integrity," unquote. That is the kind of bipartisanship we need to solve our border challenges. In fact, it appears our colleagues in the Senate are on the verge of reaching a bipartisan border deal. It's not too late to work with them to get the bill signed into law. I urge my colleagues to honor their oaths to the Constitution and drop this sham impeachment, and to give my colleagues a chance to rethink this political stunt. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now adjourn.
I'll recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of comment on the amendment in the nature of the substitute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we should certainly, I think, be embarrassed to be here today. This is a complete sham impeachment. I also like to point out that the previous speaker on this committee has been spending a lot of her time actually fundraising off of this impeachment effort, and so the fact that she's posturing to taking it seriously, I think, is quite a joke as well. Now, in this Congress, which is the least productive that we've had, as we all know, since the 1930s, we've only passed 23 laws, and most of those, of course, have been generally terrible laws. But when the extreme majority cannot pass laws, they resort to political stunts and stunt impeachments, the one against the president, and certainly the one here today. Now, we have heard over and over from constitutional scholars, including Republicans, that there's no basis for this impeachment. And I want to take a moment to correct the record on a couple things. I've heard my Republican colleagues claim that Trump secured the border and somehow President Biden opened it. Let's be clear and review the facts. The spike in migration started under Donald Trump. Border Patrol apprehensions actually tripled in the last 8 months of the Trump presidency, rising from more than 21,000 in May 2020 to over 71,000 that December as he was leaving office. So the migration spike started under Donald Trump, and we should make that very clear. Now, today, Secretary Mayorkas is also dealing with the fallout of historic crises happening across Latin America. Venezuela has completely collapsed and is in crisis. Ecuador is dealing with a historic gang crisis. Cuba and Haiti are also facing enormous challenges as well. The whole region is struggling to recover from extreme weather, droughts, and COVID-19. Meanwhile, a historic economic recovery in the US has created a demand for workers. Now, all of this impacts the border. But we know that's not all. The majority blames Secretary Mayorkas for his policies for the surge of people coming here to seek asylum, but they won't accept any legislative proposals or funding to deal with the problem when the president and the secretary offer them. Speaker Johnson has told Fox News multiple occasions now that he's taking his orders from Trump on the border. And he just said recently, as of today, that he won't even take up the Senate deal. Donald Trump speaks about immigrants with the same rhetoric that Hitler did, claiming that immigrants like me and my family, and I quote, pollute the blood of this country. He wants chaos, and he's admitted he even would like to see a recession happening this year. But I want to remind the public and the majority that Donald Trump...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I want to remind the public that Donald Trump and House Republicans also have their own ideas for the border. So let's review the majority's border ideas that they've actually presented. Here they are. Donald Trump actually has said that he wants to build alligator moats along the border. That's one of his incredible ideas. Another idea that Donald Trump has promoted is he actually wants to electrify the border fence and maybe even put some spikes on the border. That's another Donald Trump and MAGA majority border idea. Another idea, which I'm not sure how well it would go, is he wants to actually bomb northern Mexico with missiles. That's another Trump idea. And finally, I think one of the ones that I think is the most grotesque is suggestions that instead we should maybe just shoot migrants in the legs as they cross the border. So once again, the Donald Trump and MAGA plan is alligator moats, bombing northern Mexico, shooting migrants in the legs, and electrifying the fence and putting spikes on them. That is the Donald Trump border plan. And so, again, we are here today with these horrific ideas being presented constantly by the former president. This is all about trying to get Donald Trump reelected. Donald Trump himself is saying he wants no solutions this year out of the Congress, and Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden continue to offer solutions every day and are ready to actually talk about real immigration and border solutions in this country. And with that, I yield
Mr.
back.
Garcia, will you yield for a clarifying question?
Sure.
Can you clarify what you mean by the analogy that you just said that Donald Trump was Hitler?
Well, when you say that you want to pollute, when immigrants are polluting this country, that to me, and the blood of this country, that is absolutely reminiscent of things that Adolf Hitler said. And in fact, his imagery, the way he supports white nationalism, the way he supports white supremacy, and those kind of comments are completely offensive to immigrants and hopefully to all Americans in this country.
So just to be clear, you were drawing an analogy between Donald Trump saying he is like Hitler.
I'm drawing an analogy that the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses is very much the rhetoric and the type of rhetoric that Adolf Hitler used.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes of discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's a sad day that we're here. I don't think anybody takes any pleasure in being here. In fact, this is really the last resort that our founders intended to use an impeachment as a check and a balance. I personally have wrestled with the appropriate congressional response to what has been a willful refusal to comply with the law, to adhere to congressional directives, and more importantly, to secure a homeland. The failure to secure the border has been so significant, so catastrophic, so egregious that Congress must now use its power to provide accountability. And we must be the check and the balance against such an extremely egregious breach of the public trust. You know, families around the country have lost confidence in the secretary, in the government, in the administration. I show you this picture right here of the Tambunga family. This is a button that the Tambungas sat right there when Secretary Mayorkas was testifying. The 71-year-old grandmother was killed. The 7-year-old granddaughter was killed by a human trafficker doing 100 miles an hour in West Texas. carrying 11 illegal aliens, evading capture, and tragically slammed into their vehicle, instantly killing them. For Maria and Amelia's sake, if not this effort, then what? She sat, the daughter of Maria sat with Secretary Mayorkas and said, this is not political, we want you to secure the border, and yet nothing has been done. We passed H.R. 2 in May of last year. When you go to the border, when you talk to Border Patrol, when you talk to ICE agents, what they tell you is that there are no consequences. That the Secretary has willfully refused to enforce the laws that are on the books. And I asked rhetorically to the other side, if not this effort, then how do you hold accountability? Do you think that this has been a success? We offer these articles of impeachment today, a willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law, an egregious breach of public trust, because we do take seriously our oath. We do take seriously the check and the balance. There's been 3 years that the other side has had to make a change, and they haven't. And this is the last resort, which is why this is a sad day. The other side is going to say this is policy difference. No, it's not. These are not policy differences. This is a debate. This is not a debate about taxes or spending. This is a debate about following the law, which the executive branch should be doing, and yet they're not. Do you remember the 53 people that were killed in a tractor trailer south of San Antonio in July of last year? They were locked up. A smuggler left them to rot and perish in a tractor trailer. That's what this is about. The Secretary has done nothing, has absolutely done nothing to make our country more secure. He has weakened us in every single case.
Will the gentleman yield for a quick question?
Just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Mayorkas sat right there next to Director Wray, and I asked a question of the 300 people who have matched the terror watch list. Director Wray, are there still people at large in this country that you know match the terror watch list, but you don't know where they are? Director Wray answered, yes, there are people still at large that match the terror watch list. Secretary Mayorkas, I asked him, do you have a policy to detain people that match the terror watch list? And he would not answer in the affirmative. That's why we're here today, because he has willfully refused time and time again to enforce the laws on the books. We've given many solutions. The Senate hasn't taken them up. It's this type of behavior that brings us here.
Will the gentleman yield
This is
for
an
a question?
extreme position.
Will the gentleman yield
position-
for a question?
No, I will not. My silence to you was the answer. The extreme position is that of my colleague completely disregarding a mother who was here just a few weeks ago that lost her kids to fentanyl. That's why we're here. I've got to think that on this other side of the aisle, that you think that this is a complete and utter failure to secure the homeland. That's why Republicans are here, and I hope that you will join in calling it out and doing the right thing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman is not recognized.
At the
I now
southern border.
recognize Mr. Gonzalez for his 5 minutes of discussion.
I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. And, one of the best things about Congress is we all represent districts from across the country and we have debate. And I think that's very positive. One of the most difficult things about Congress is it's filled with nothing but lawyers, and they'll talk all day about this, that, or the other, which is, I think, frustrating to many Americans. This is what's going to happen. The House of Representatives is going to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it. That's going to happen. In my district in Texas, we're feeling this. In Arizona, they're feeling it. In California, they're feeling it. There is not one district in America that is not impacted by this border crisis. So I would like to focus on what happens next. What are we going to do after that? What are we going to do? Are we going to have a conversation on how we secure the border? Are we going to continue to blame others for everything that's wrong? I would like to see this border secured in a manner that protects everybody. And I do think there's an opportunity to do that. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come up with a conclusion that makes America on the track of keeping people safe and secure. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman.
On the operational control of the border, as that term is defined in the Secure Fence Act of 2006. That, of course, requires 0 immigrants from crossing the border in order to achieve that standard. And of course, that's unreasonable, unattainable. So in 2007, under the Bush administration, the department issued guidelines to redefine what operational control is. So if you are actually trying to point to this and the letter of the law, then you ought to talk to your colleagues in the Wayback Machine in 2007 who changed that definition.
Gentleman's time has expired.
The gentleman yield? Would
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mrs. Green for 5 minutes to comment on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're listening to Democrats today talk about Secretary Mayorkas requesting funding from Congress and talking about detention space. But the facts tell the truth. Secretary Mayorkas has requested less detention space. Fiscal year 2020, $2.7 billion for 54,000 beds, including 2,500 for family units. Fiscal year 2021, $3.1 billion for 60,000 beds, including 5,000 for family units. Fiscal year 2022, he requested $1.8 billion for 32,500 beds. Fiscal year 2023, he requested $1.4 billion for 25,000 beds. And in fiscal year 2024, Secretary Mayorkas reduced it again down to $1.3 billion for 25,000 beds. This is a reduction of 9,000 from fiscal year 23 enacted. DHS has not provided Congress with statutorily mandated reports on detention needs as required under 8 U.S.C. 1368 and requested by the committee in a letter on January 4th, 2024. Also, DHS claims in fiscal year 22 and 23 budget requests that a reduction in detention capacity level will not impede ICE's ability to apprehend, detain, and remove non-citizens that present a threat to national security, border security, and public safety. Secretary Mayorkas closed detention facilities, closed them, while paroling en masse millions of illegal aliens into our country. By December 2021, DHS stopped using family detention centers for family units. In March 2022, ICE announced it would close an Alabama detention facility and limit the use of 3 others in Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina. Secretary Mayorkas refused to utilize MPP. But let's talk about what has been the result of that. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. And what has this done for the cartels? Cartels and coyotes are making over $13 billion a year in human trafficking alone off of Secretary Mayorkas's willful breaking of federal immigration laws. This revenue is 26 times more than cartels earned under President Trump, approximately $500 million under Trump, according to the New York Times. But what is that doing? This is trafficking children, trafficking women. This is what, he is not holding these people. He is not detaining these people. He's not coming to us and asking us for more money. He's asking us for less money. He's asking us for less beds. And then he's closing down detention facilities. It is an outright lie to claim that Secretary Mayorkas is following the law when in fact he's not. He is breaking the law. And he is paroling them by the millions into the interior of the United States. What else has happened since then? Fentanyl, the #1 killer for Americans between ages 18 and 45. Let's also talk about how many Americans are dying. 300 Americans a day are dying. Let's talk about what that does to people like 2 of my constituents, Jose and Isabel Lerma, who were killed in a human smuggling pursuit caused by Mayorkas's open border policies. What about 20-year-old Kayla Marie Hamilton? Remember her mother? Poor Kayla was raped and strangled to death by an illegal MS-13 gang member who was actually apprehended at the border. Apprehended. He had gang tattoos on his body. But because Secretary Mayorkas breaks federal law, he says, go ahead and release these people into our country. And this 20-year-old was raped and murdered by an MS-13 gang member who should have never been in the United States. This is the outcome. That's just one example. We could spend hours and hours. You know what? We could go all week, and I'm sure Chairman Green would let us do it if we talked about every American who has been affected by Secretary Mayorkas willfully breaking federal immigration law. Is that what we must do? If we must, we must. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes discussing the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H-Res 863 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas, number 117.
The gentlelady is recognized to speak on her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the Founding Fathers deliberated for a period of time to ensure that the American public for ages beyond would be protected. And so their interpretation of impeachment, which, by the way, to answer a question posed some many minutes and hours ago, yes, there is authority to do our job. Yes, impeachment does exist. As Professor Charles Black has indicated, it deals with other high crimes and misdemeanors. In particular, impeachment is focused on the idea of treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors. Professor Black notes that in his influential handbook, impeachment is not permitted for mere inefficient administration or administration that does not accord with Congress' view of good policy. Simply put, the Constitution forbids impeachment based on policy disagreements between the House and the executive branch, no matter how intense or high stakes those differences of opinion are. I would venture to say that the disruption of a presidential election in 2020 was not a mere disagreement between Congress and the executive, a direct connection to disrupting the election and changing the election, nor was an outright insurrection on January 6th could be equal to the idea of a disagreement with Congress. And so what we have here today are two articles with no constitutional basis of charging a secretary or a public figure anything dealing with an unconstitutional violation. It has been 9 months since our committee's chair told his donors in Tennessee to, quote, get the popcorn, unquote, for his 5-phase predetermined plan to impeach a cabinet secretary over policy differences. Over 9 months, the hearings floundered. Not a shrivel of evidence of high crimes or misdemeanors. Why they wish to not read my amendment, which is to eliminate Article 1, because as our Secretary formerly of Homeland Security, of whom I worked with, has indicated, again, he emphasized, Secretary Chertoff, political and policy disagreements aren't impeachable offenses. To the American public, he made it as a simple statement of fact. The Constitution gives Congress the power to impeach federal officials for treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. That is a high bar, and we do not have that. And now, after 2 impeachment hearings with no Republican-invited constitutional experts, my colleagues across the aisle have rushed to their pre-planned, predetermined conclusion to impeach Secretary Mayorkas. As I said earlier, this is revenge impeachment. I got you. That's despite Republicans not affording Secretary Mayorkas any rights to participate in the process, unlike the previous impeachments of former President Trump. They claim that the Secretary is playing a game of cat and mouse, but my Republican colleagues rejected the Secretary's offer to testify before the committee on a different day. He details that in a very effective, lengthy letter that, yes, we did receive in the early morning hours, but he did provide that with us, for us. A day where he was not already planning to host Mexican officials to do what our colleagues want him to do, the job of stopping fentanyl. The meeting was to collaborate on clamping down on fentanyl trafficking and reducing unlawful crossings. Isn't that interesting? Performing his constitutional duties, and he was rejected. And the chair of this committee did not act upon our properly entered Minority Day hearing request to call on constitutional experts to discuss this impeachment process. Republican attorneys general, masquerading as constitutional experts, don't provide an insightful view into the impeachment, just a partisan one, but more importantly, they are not constitutional experts. They deal with the laws of their state, not the laws that we are governed by in the United States, Congress, or this committee in particular. They should be guided by the Constitution, inasmuch as states are subject to the power of the federal government that seems to be missing in several of our states today. But I guess Republicans consider the two impeachment hearings methodical. In light of these observations, my amendment seeks to strike Article 1 of the Articles of Impeachment. The article is filled with unsubstantiated allegations and a general lack of understanding of both historic border policy and U.S. immigration law. My colleagues want to impeach the Secretary for allegedly not enforcing immigration law.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
And I hope to continue by one of my colleagues yielding. At this time, I reserve what I did not have to reserve.
The gentlelady yields.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. Does anyone want to speak on the amendment? No. Her amendment, Republicans go first. So is there a Republican? Nope. Okay. You're recognized, Mr. Magaziner, for 5 minutes to discuss the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll begin by yielding back to Ms. Jackson-Lee.
You're very kind, sir. Thank you so very much. Let me say that, again, my colleagues want to impeach the Secretary for allegedly not enforcing the immigration law. Be reminded, my colleagues, that he was attempting to meet with Mexican officials to enforce laws to determine what laws we could work on together, and which he could not be at this particular hearing and was not given another option. They seem not to understand that Congress provides the funding for and sets the minimum threshold for detention levels, and Congress has never provided the resources to detain all undocumented migrants. DHS is currently detaining more people than required by this body, while Republicans refuse to consider the Secretary's request for more funds to further increase the bed space. Similarly, Congress has never provided the resources to remove all eligible non-citizens. No administration have ever requested funding for such a large deportation scheme. We have not even tried to participate in legal, if you will, immigration by providing the necessary tools. I didn't say that they would all be granted for asylum. And so we have an extensive backlog in all forms of assessing the migrants coming across the border. Therefore, Secretary Mayorkas uses prosecutorial discretion in the absence of other tools in accordance with longstanding precedent, and rightly instructs the officers and agents to prioritize threats to public safety, national security, and border security as the American people would want them to do. How do you protect us, Mr. Secretary? Well, I've been given zero by this Congress. They've done nothing for comprehensive immigration reform, so I'm going to, in my best judgment, as a public servant, following the Constitution, doing my duty, try to ensure that you will have the opportunity to be safe. The prioritization doesn't stop him from enforcing the law. He's already removed and expelled more people than the Trump administration. My colleagues also want to impeach the Secretary for executing his parole authority in a way that aligns with decades of precedent. Every administration since Eisenhower has used parole. Its first use was actually for 30,000 Hungarian nationals fleeing communism. President Trump used parole to expedite the reunification of Cuban families facing long waits for immigrant visas. Now Republicans want to say it can't be used on a case-by-case basis for Ukrainians fleeing Russian aggression, or the multitude of different persons that are now coming across the border because, again, there was no stand-up Republican Party to provide the resources, stand up to the cause, to provide the resources that would allow for this secretary to perform his job. My amendment affords my Republican colleagues to go back to the table for an opportunity to do their job and to correct their baseless allegations, of which I would care for them to adopt their own instructions. Secretary Chertoff said, that is why Republicans aren't seeking to hold Mr. Mayorkas to the Constitution's high crimes and misdemeanors standard for impeachment. They make the unsupported argument that he is derelict in his duty, and they have no basis to be able to suggest that. And Secretary Chertoff goes on to say, the truth is that our national immigration system is outdated, and DHS leaders under both parties have done their best to manage our immigration system without adequate congressional support. But no Democrat, during the time that we were in the majority, attempted to impeach our Secretaries of Homeland Security when they respectively had challenges and difficulties sending or returning migrants that were coming to this country. So let me, as I conclude, we have been executing, and this is by way of Secretary Mayorkas, but no one wants to listen to. We have been executing an unprecedented and high-impact campaign to disrupt, dismantle the smuggling organizations. More than 14,000 smugglers throughout the region have been arrested, and thousands have been prosecuted under federal law. We have worked with Mexico to conduct mirrored patrols along the southwest border, protection of the southwest border. And we have worked with Mexico and other countries to increase interdictions along the migratory routes, include repatriation flights, and execute the removal of third country nationals. Last year, we secured funding to hire 300 more Border Patrol. We scrapped and got whatever we could get.
Gentlelady, your time has expired,
And
but
so
I think
ask my
Mr.
colleagues
Thinadar
to
is going to
support
yield to you.
the Jackson Lee
Mr.
amendment
Thinadar,
to
you're
eliminate
recognized.
Article 1. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Mr. Magaziner is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Representative Tannadar. I want to speak in favor of Ms. Jackson Lee's amendment. The legal case for impeachment in these articles is incredibly thin, and I want everyone to understand this. In Article 1, the argument that House Republicans are making is that somehow Secretary Mayorkas is choosing not to follow the law because a portion of migrants apprehended at the border are not being detained until their cases are heard. But again, there is not enough detention capacity because this Congress has not provided that funding for that capacity. Stats and numbers don't lie. For fiscal year 2024, and I want everyone to hear this, Congress provided funding for 34,000 beds in ICE detention centers, 34,000. The average daily population in those detention centers is 37,000 people. They are at capacity. So there may be individual examples of certain facilities at certain times that are not at capacity for safety reasons or health reasons or whatever the case may be. But overall, across the system, we are at and above capacity. And so what should the Secretary do? The Secretary, because he has not received the funding to provide adequate detention capacity, has to use his judgment for who to detain and who to release. That is not illegal. It is certainly not impeachable, and it is the exact same kind of discretion that every other director before him has used. In the last 2 years of the Trump administration, 52% of migrants apprehended at the southern border were released, not detained. 52%, nearly 1 million people. I did not hear my Republican colleagues trying to impeach the secretary or acting secretary under the Trump administration during those years, but here they are trying to impeach Secretary Mayorkas for doing the exact same thing. And in fact, the percentage of migrants who have been released under the Biden administration, 48%, is lower than the 52% rate under the last 2 years of the Trump administration. In Article 2, and that's, by the way, that is essentially their whole argument in Article 1, so we can forget that. Article 2, they are arguing that somehow the Secretary has lied to Congress because at various times he said things like the border was secure or the border was closed. These are subjective terms. Again, certainly not impeachable. If he said, you know, we're holding an average daily count of 37,000 people a day when it was really 10,000 a day, well, that would be a lie. That would be misstating a fact. But characterizing the situation on the ground in a way that my Republican colleagues might disagree with is certainly not impeachable or a lie. If I say to you, it's hot outside and you think it's cold, I haven't lied to you. If I say to you it's 80 degrees and it's actually 40 degrees, well, that might be a lie.
Would the gentleman yield?
But I'll just say once again, you're talking about terms like closed, secure, that are inherently subjective terms. Oh, okay. I mean, there are certain terms like operationally secure that may have a legal definition, but again, the idea that this would be an impeachable offense is ludicrous. There is no law that my colleagues have pointed to that has been broken, and particularly when it comes to the Secretary using his discretion to decide how to manage the lack of capacity because Congress has not provided the resources that he has asked for. He's using the same discretion that every secretary before him has used.
The gentleman yield quick for...
Yield to Mr. Goldman.
Just to follow up on Mr. Magaziner's point on the operational control of the border, as that term is defined in the Secure Fence Act of 2006, that, of course, requires 0 immigrants from crossing the border in order to achieve that standard. And of course, that's unreasonable, unattainable. So in 2007, under the Bush administration, the department issued guidelines to redefine what operational control is. So if you are actually trying to point to this and the letter of the law, then you ought to talk to your colleagues in the Wayback Machine in 2007 who changed that definition.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Would the gentleman yield? Would
The
the gentleman
gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mrs. Green for 5 minutes to comment on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're listening to Democrats today talk about Secretary Mayorkas requesting funding from Congress and talking about detention space. But the facts tell the truth. Secretary Mayorkas has requested less detention space. Fiscal year 2020, $2.7 billion for 54,000 beds, including 2,500 for family units. Fiscal year 2021, $3.1 billion for 60,000 beds, including 5,000 for family units. Fiscal year 2022, he requested $1.8 billion for 32,500 beds. Fiscal year 2023, he requested $1.4 billion for 25,000 beds. And in fiscal year 2024, Secretary Mayorkas reduced it again down to $1.3 billion for 25,000 beds. This is a reduction of 9,000 from fiscal year 23 enacted. DHS has not provided Congress with statutorily mandated reports on detention needs as required under 8 U.S.C. 1368 and requested by the committee in a letter on January 4th, 2024. Also, DHS claims in fiscal year 22 and 23 budget requests that a reduction in detention capacity level will not impede ICE's ability to apprehend, detain, and remove non-citizens that present a threat to national security, border security, and public safety. Secretary Mayorkas closed detention facilities, closed them, while paroling en masse millions of illegal aliens into our country. By December 2021, DHS stopped using family detention centers for family units. In March 2022, ICE announced it would close an Alabama detention facility and limit the use of 3 others in Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina. Secretary Mayorkas refused to utilize MPP. But let's talk about what has been the result of that. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. And what has this done for the cartels? Cartels and coyotes are making over $13 billion a year in human trafficking alone off of Secretary Mayorkas's willful breaking of federal immigration laws. This revenue is 26 times more than cartels earned under President Trump, approximately $500 million under Trump, according to the New York Times. But what is that doing? This is trafficking children, trafficking women. This is what, he is not holding these people. He is not detaining these people. He's not coming to us and asking us for more money. He's asking us for less money. He's asking us for less beds. And then he's closing down detention facilities. It is an outright lie to claim that Secretary Mayorkas is following the law when in fact he's not. He is breaking the law. And he is paroling them by the millions into the interior of the United States. What else has happened since then? Fentanyl, the #1 killer for Americans between ages 18 and 45. Let's also talk about how many Americans are dying. 300 Americans a day are dying. Let's talk about what that does to people like 2 of my constituents, Jose and Isabel Lerma, who were killed in a human smuggling pursuit caused by Mayorkas's open border policies. What about 20-year-old Kayla Marie Hamilton? Remember her mother? Poor Kayla was raped and strangled to death by an illegal MS-13 gang member who was actually apprehended at the border. Apprehended. He had gang tattoos on his body. But because Secretary Mayorkas breaks federal law, he says, go ahead and release these people into our country. And this 20-year-old was raped and murdered by an MS-13 gang member who should have never been in the United States. This is the outcome. That's just one example. We could spend hours and hours. You know what? We could go all week, and I'm sure Chairman Green would let us do it if we talked about every American who has been affected by Secretary Mayorkas willfully breaking federal immigration law. Is that what we must do? If we must, we must. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes discussing the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Jackson Lee,
I thank the gentleman, and forgive me, Mr. Magazine, that I didn't thank you and you yielded. Thank you so very much. Let me give us all a suggestion. Let us move to adjourn this meeting and have an authorization meeting, because my heart goes out to every single victim that has suffered a loss of life, being a family member or who's died in this terrible scourge of drug trafficking or fentanyl. And let's have a meeting that deals with authorizing Secretary Mayorkas $20 billion to be able to do the job that we understand he has not done, because he has not asked for $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion, $6 billion, $7 billion. It goes to the very point that we are making. These are policy decisions. These are decisions that the Budget Committee participates in, the Appropriations Committee participates in. And it may be in the overall discussion of the budget of this nation or appropriations that the secretary was given the amount that he could work with, policy. And it wasn't a constitutional decision, it was, this is the budget for DHS. And the billions that you are asking or maybe need will have to be dropped down. And so I can't for the life of me see why my colleagues cannot understand that you are dealing clearly with the issue of a policy decision and a very wise secretary that is trying to do his job by protecting us in the narrow way that he's allowed to do so. Here are my resources. Here is who I can detain. And for the information of this committee, many Republicans want to use our immigration and criminal justice system to solve public health crisis or blame the secretary. Under President Biden's leadership, overdose deaths have decreased or been flat each month for 6 consecutive months. As well, we have reported, based on a rolling 12-month count, with significant increases during the final year of the Trump administration. We didn't have that. With Democrats, we've been working to bring it down and to stop the scourge of drug trafficking. In September 2021, during the first year of the Biden administration, the DOJ and DEA announced law enforcement surge that resulted in the seizure of far more of these fentanyl pills and other horrible aspects. And so the real question is, how long are we going to pursue a question of behavior under your job versus direct acts that result in the death of people? Are you telling me Secretary Mayorkas was directly involved in killing people? Would we go to that length? Would we so much even suggest that the smugglers and the cartels gaining profits have now rendered under Secretary Mayorkas under Article 2 that talks about the breach of trust? Or has he benefited monetarily? Who would want to stand and say that? And so we're getting to a point now where it really is a question of understanding. And that understanding is that Article 1 does not fit any of the charges that the Republicans are making against this gentleman. They're not constitutionally grounded. And we have not allowed the secretary, who is now engaged in negotiations now for over a month, I believe, or more, with the Senate, a very table that the House Republicans have been invited to sit at, the very table that the Speaker of the House has been invited to sit at. And my understanding is that their seats are vacant. But yet our Secretary of Homeland Security, under the threat of impeachment, at every point has gotten up every day to participate in abiding by laws that he hopes will make this country safer. Is that the basis of impeachment? Is that the accusation that will hold under this Article 1? Mr. Chairman, it will not hold, and I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment and vote down Article 1.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
thank
I
you,
now
Mr.
recognize Mr. Guest for 5 minutes to discuss the amendment.
On the detail of the 7 separate statutory commands that have been consistently flouted by Secretary Mayorkas, I do think that, to your point, it is understandable when someone says the border is secure. You can't call this border secure.
No.
In any fairness. Now, you can call the border untenable, as Mr. Goldman calls it. You can call the border not secure, as President Biden calls it. But it's been a device. The Secretary of Homeland Security has come here and come to the Judiciary Committee and come to other committees on the Hill over and over and over again and sat there and smugly defied this Congress to say, these committees, to say that this border is secure so that he could continue a process of thoroughly undermining the Immigration and Nationalities Act, so that he could violate it in every particular because it was purposeful. And it is only now that Mr. Goldman is constrained to say that the border is untenable. The situation at the border is untenable. Untenable cannot be reconciled with secure. It is not a secure border. I yield back to the chairman.
Actually, it was Mr. Goldman who said it was a humanitarian crisis several months ago when I did lay out those processes, just FYI.
The chairman yield for a quick question?
You got 7 seconds.
You listed out all the problems with fentanyl and human trafficking, and assuming that is correct, and assuming that the statistics about removals and fentanyl arrests and seizures are also correct, do you think the fact that we have a fentanyl problem in this country is grounds to impeach a cabinet secretary?
No, I think that's the effect. The cause is saying the Congress shall detain, shall deport if there's not credible fear, and he's done none of those. You look at the deportation.
What does that have to do with fentanyl?
We're not going to have a debate. I'm answering the question, and the time has expired.
Chairman?
Anybody? Mr. Magaziner, you recognize.
Thank you. A lot to respond to here. Let me first start by thanking the chairman for acknowledging that Joe Biden won the election. I know that some of his colleagues on the other side of the aisle disagree with that, but I thank him for acknowledging it. And I also thank him for acknowledging the fact that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have shifted personnel and resources to the southern border, yet another sign that the Secretary is doing his job in endeavoring to secure the border, despite the lack of support that he has been getting from the Republican Congress. It would be even easier if they would take up the supplemental funding request for 1,400 more Border Patrol officers, for 1,000 more CIS officers that the president has asked for. But of course, this isn't about actually solving the problem for my Republican colleagues. It is about having an issue. Let's take a step back here. There is a real risk that if we move forward with this, it will open the floodgates by establishing a new precedent for impeachment based not on the Constitution.
Will the gentleman yield?
In a minute. Based not on the Constitution, based not on bribery or treason or high crimes or misdemeanors, but policy differences and politics. There is no legal basis here in these articles. Article 1 alleges, as Mr. Bishop said, that the Secretary has been willfully ignoring the law. He is not. Under his watch, 4 million individuals have been removed from this country. The detention centers are at capacity because he is detaining people, and he is detaining people at approximately the same rate as under the Trump administration. In Article 2, we are debating Article 2, and we are reduced to talking about, is the word secure a fact or an opinion? Clearly, it is an opinion. Clearly, questions like, is the border open or closed, is based on opinion. And clearly, as Mr. Goldman has laid out, when the Secretary clarified his remarks about operational control, he was referring to the regulatory definition, not the statutory definition. But regardless, if we open the floodgates here, earlier, before the recess, I listed 5 times that Trump cabinet secretaries were caught in obvious lies in their testimony to Congress. Are we going to be doing baseless impeachments every time there's a game of gotcha that the opposite party is trying to play? The Secretary has, as Mr. Bishop noted, appeared here again and again and again. I believe that was his quote. And my Republican colleagues have been parsing every word, trying to find something that could be construed as a mistruth. If we are going to be playing that game and playing this gotcha every single time somebody comes to appear before Congress, we're going to be opening the floodgates to baseless impeachments that are going to bring our country to a really perilous place. So, taking a step back here, I hope that we can get back to debating policy on immigration and the border. I hope that we can get back to talking about solutions. But instead, we run the risk of opening the floodgates here to baseless impeachments based on games of gotcha that are going to damage our republic. Mr. Pfluger?
Gentleman
Now
yields. Did you ask him to yield, or?
I asked him earlier to yield.
Okay, you're recognized.
I appreciate the commentary on impeachments. I know you weren't here at the time of the last impeachment and the one previous to that, but I do appreciate the fact that you talked about baseless impeachments, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else want to speak on the?
I'll yield to Mr. Swalwell. I have some time left.
Sorry, I was going to take 5 minutes. I thought he was done. Yeah.
Oh, do you want? Okay, I'll yield back then.
I now recognize Mr. Swalwell for 5 minutes.
When it comes to the border, you can, in Washington, admire the problem, you can weaponize the problem, you can politicize the problem, or you can do the hard work and you can try and solve the damn problem. And that offer is there. That offer was there in 2014 when 68 Republicans, some of the most conservative Republicans, worked with Democrats in the Senate to come up with a bipartisan agreement. And that offer is there now. I want to talk first about Secretary Mayorkas. Look, this guy needs a badge to come into the building. He's here so often. I mean, he's literally the most testifying member of the cabinet. And he came here for worldwide threats. And to say that the border is not a threat, I mean, that's what we're all concerned about. So if he's here for worldwide threats, of course he's going to be talking about the border. That's his job, and he did, and that's where most of the questions were about. And any shortcomings that Mayorkas may have, frankly, are your fault. He's asking for authorities to do more, to have more border agents, to have more resources. And so his limitations are caused by you. You put him in place. You won't let him do it. And anyone who wants to proceed with this impeachment but voted against a guy who incited a mob and aimed a mob at a Capitol and had all of us running for our lives, if you didn't vote for that one, I don't understand how you can stand here and say this one is credible. The border is a real issue. It is a real issue. No one in this room wants an open border, despite the accusations that are made. We want security at the border. That's why Senator Lankford, the second most conservative member of the Senate, according to the American Conservative Union, has been working with Democrats and the president to immediately solve this issue. Senator Thune, he's no rhino, I don't think. Senator Thune said that the best chance to solve any issues at the border is under President Biden. And he said it's not going to happen under President Trump. And this is all in the spirit of what President Biden has done over the last 3 years. Bipartisan infrastructure bill, bipartisan CHIPS Act, bipartisan Safer Communities Act to address gun violence, all bipartisan. And we have an opportunity to do a bipartisan border bill and address the threats that I keep hearing here every day. But it's the difference between wanting to weaponize the problem and wanting to solve the problem. And you see so many on their side. Border Patrol agents, God bless them, they're heroes. They'll seize fentanyl, and to just own the libs, they'll say, see, this is Joe Biden's border crisis. I don't understand. Were they not supposed to seize the fentanyl? Like, they got the bad guys. They got the fentanyl. And by the way, 90% of the fentanyl is coming through ports of entry. That's a separate problem. The only high crime that is happening in this room is the fact that we are doing anything but working on a bipartisan deal that's taking place in the Senate. That's the crime. We're wasting time if we're not solving this. And I just invite my colleagues, go back, please, to your election night, the first time that you ran. I remember it. My mom, my dad were there. They were more surprised than I was that I won. Your friends, your family are there, and you give that gracious speech about what you're going to do when you're going to go to Congress. And I don't think any of you said in that speech, as you thanked your supporters, I want to go to Washington to take on small issues. You all ran for Congress to go to Washington to take on big issues. And this is a big issue. It's not an easy issue. It's a complicated issue. But there's a bipartisan path forward. So I urge my colleagues, when it comes to the border, choose the fix, not the fiction. Choose the fix not Fox, and choose the fix and not fame. And we can live up to the promise that we made to our constituents when we made that decision to run for Congress and do big things and solve tough problems. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Guest, the gentleman from Mississippi, for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Again, very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I know I sound like a broken record, but again, for my colleagues across the aisle to say that Republicans don't want to fix the problem, that we've offered no solutions, that we've just sat around and hoped that the crisis at the border has gotten worse, is a complete fabrication and a completely false statement. Mr. Chairman, you've mentioned H.R. 2, the legislation that we passed out of this House, that H.R. 2 would have employed 22,000 CBP officers, the highest number in history. And not only do we authorize that in H.R. 2, but in the House Appropriations package where we funded the Department of Homeland Security, we actually funded that. Our appropriations package that passed out of the House with no Democrat support funded 22,000 agents. We actually put more money in the budget than the president requested. It is $3 billion more than the budget was last year. And so when Republicans are plussing up what the presidential request is, when Republicans are investing in technology, where we're investing in retention bonuses, where we're hiring more agents, to hear my colleagues across the aisle say that we're doing nothing to solve the problem. And I continue to hear about this solution in the Senate. The Senate is crafting this bipartisan legislation, which now for weeks we've been waiting on bill text. Weeks. And has the Senate engaged the House? Have they engaged members of this committee? Maybe they have on the other side of the aisle. Maybe Ranking Member Thompson or maybe other members of the committee on the Democratic aisle have been briefed on what is going to be in the bill. But we have been shut out of those talks. We are not part of that solution. We don't know what that is. And so when people say we need to go ahead and we need to just adopt what the Senate is going to send over, I want to see what's in there. I mean, for weeks and weeks and weeks, we have been waiting on this. And so, Mr. Chairman, and the effort to not continue to beat a dead horse, Republicans have offered solutions. Republicans have offered solutions in funding. Republicans have offered solutions statutorily in H.R. 2. Republicans have time and time again done everything that we know to do to fix this crisis. But the one thing we can't do is we cannot make Secretary Mayorkas enforce the law. And the only remedy that we have left is to impeach the Secretary for his refusal to enforce the law and to impeach the Secretary for his lying to Congress. And I disagree with my colleagues across the aisle that a secure border is some vague term that nobody knows what it is and that we have no idea. And that when we start throwing facts at it about numbers of immigrants who are coming across the border each and every month, and we see those numbers continue to spike and continue to rise. We see the number of people who are dying every day from fentanyl. Yes, we're catching more fentanyl coming across the border, but do you know that the leading cause of death for individuals 18 to 49 are drug overdoses? Most of those caused by the use of fentanyl, and that fentanyl comes across our southern border. And so when confronted with those facts, do we have a secure border? The answer is clearly no. And the answer is no because this cabinet secretary refuses to enforce the law.
Gentleman yield?
I yield.
It's interesting. The point that you made about the House Republican DHS bill, including money for 22,000 more Border Patrol officers.
Total.
Agents. 3,000 more. Thank you. 22,000. 3,000 more. It is interesting. How can it be? We hear constantly from the other side of the aisle that Republicans won't support the additional spending, and yet that's in there. How do you reconcile those two? Here's the answer for Mr. and Mrs. America if they're watching this. They only want the money for one reason: to process more illegals into the country faster. That's what they want more money for. And if you think that solves the problem of the immigrants camped out on the sidewalk, outside the Roosevelt Hotel in Mr. Goldman's district. It does not. It does not solve or alleviate the problems that are destroying New York City. It does not solve the problems that are destroying Chicago and Denver, and so on and so forth. That ain't going to get it done. Yield.
The gentleman yields, and the gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else who wishes to?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague, whom I regularly disagree with, but I genuinely respect, Mr. Goldman asked earlier, could any of us identify I believe your question was, could any of us identify what a secure border looked like?
Just to clarify, if I may.
I think so.
I said no two of you would
Yeah, well,
write
I'm
the
just one.
same specific definition,
I'm
which is
not
what
trying
is
to give you an
required
answer.
for a false statement.
I'm going to try and give you an answer because it's pretty clear. You ready? 2019. That's what a secure border looked like. The third and fourth quarter of 2019. I skipped right over 2020. I'll give you all that because COVID interrupted the cartel operations. So we're going to skip those numbers. Let's go to pre-COVID numbers. Third and fourth quarter, 2019, 554,872 southwest border CBP encounters. You had more than that in the last 2 months under this administration. How much money did we spend? Listen to me, America. The total budget for DHS in 2019 was $81 million. 81, that's a lot. I can't read this, my staffer. You got too many numbers here. Okay, here you go. Because I got 1 trillion numbers here. I know this wasn't. Is it 81 billion? Basically, we spent 81 billion. Listen to me. In 2019, we had the cartels on the ropes, and we spent 81 billion. Last year, they rolled over us. We're losing our country, and we sent DHS 101 billion. We spent more money, a lot more. In the Biden administration, we're giving it to Mayorkas. He's supposed to be the expert. I mean, honestly, what does President Biden know about securing the border? That's why he hired a Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He hires this man, it was his 22 years of service. It's his first 19 we were fine with. These last 3, he's been destroying our country. And we're giving him more money to do it with. So what changed? My colleagues, what changed between 2019? You think the cartels changed? All of a sudden they got hungry for more money? No. Policy, executive policy out of our White House, out of your president, that began in January of 2021. This is why our country is disintegrating, America. And who's ultimately responsible for that? The expert that President Biden hired. That's who we're impeaching today. Because we asked him to resign, we asked him to correct. He quite pompously and arrogantly rejected all of that. And kept coming before this body and our colleagues in the Senate and tell them everything's cool.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm going to yield back to the chairman, if you don't mind, my friend, Mr. Goldman.
Do any other members? Ms. Titus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But first, I want to just be sure that we understand what we're talking about the border being controlled by the cartels. You're suggesting that the cartels are controlling both sides of the border, and it's this nightmare. I'd like to quote for you Raul Ortiz, who is the chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. I will tell you that in certain areas, the cartels control an awful lot of the southern border south of the United States. They are not in the United States. They are south of the United States. And then you have Chief Patrol Agent Aaron Heike from the San Diego sector saying it's correct to say that the cartels don't actually control any land on the U.S. side of the border. So when we talk about the cartels controlling the border, let's be sure we tell the whole story. But it's not surprising that only tell part of it, because the hypocrisy of the people on that side of the aisle has just become so egregious over the course of the day that nothing surprises me. You sit here self-righteously attacking Mr. Mayorkas and saying he's not abided by the law, I guess the immigration and nationality law. He's lied, he's willfully done these things as though he has some personal motive for seeing the cartels bring in more fentanyl. He's broken the law, and that's why we've got to impeach him. So I would ask you, if somebody was accused or indicted or convicted of rape, would you think they broke the law? How about fraud? How about sexual harassment? How about sedition and subversion? And let's don't forget tax evasion. Do you all think those are laws that if you do those things, you've broken the law? Well, of course you have. And yet your candidate for president, who not a one of you have condemned or stood up and said, no, I'm not going to support that guy because he's broken all these laws. I hadn't heard you say it. You're fine to go down the path with him, but you want to attack Secretary Mayorkas for doing the best that he can and not violating any such laws as this. And I,
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. My friend from Louisiana, I have a question for you, if I may. I may not get the data right, but I believe you said that in the third and fourth quarter of 2019, there were approximately 500,000 encounters at the border. Is that right? And then over the past 2 months, there have been many more encounters at the border? So is it your view that more encounters at the border means that the Secretary of Homeland Security is doing a worse job?
The gentleman allow me to respond?
Yes, please, I yield.
Yes, sir. My perspective is likely quite different from yours, good sir. I'm a cop, and my data comes from boots on the ground. The effectiveness of our law enforcement operations under President Trump was a well-run machine because of policy.
I understand. I mean, I don't want to get into like a whole long thing.
You didn't
The only question I had, if I could
these
reclaim my
people
time.
coming in our country.
If I could reclaim my time. The only question I'm asking and the point I'm making is you're trying to make an argument that more encounters at the border means that our border is less secure.
Yes.
But what it actually means is that the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security are doing a better job of securing the border. Because you have more encounters with slightly more resources, as you said, which is on a pro rata basis doing a better job. So I'm glad, though, that my colleague from Louisiana has determined that secure, as included in Article 2 of the impeachment, is defined as the third and fourth quarter of 2019. So now we all know that that is the definition of secure that Secretary Mayorkas lied about when he said it's secure, and it's not what it was in the third and fourth quarter of 2019. I will yield to Mr. Magaziner.
78% of southern border encounters were detained under President Trump. That's a pretty good number, 78%. 78% also during the Biden administration. It is the same percentage.
Tom. Mr. Ivy's not here. I want to thank Mr. Ivy for assisting in this. We'll go to amendments on the roster. Amendment 5, Mr. Swazi. Hearing none, it's now in order to consider Amendment 5 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swazi on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8631 offered by Mr. Swazi. At the end of the following report, Not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary of Homeland Security shall submit to the Committee on Homeland
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Mr. Jimenez for this bill. This is a great idea to do this. We have to stop any sort of products coming out of the Xinjiang region where so many people are being abused, the Uyghur people are being abused. We have to stop the Chinese from having access to our technology with the malware, as you pointed out, as a possible thing that they're doing. And we need to prod the U.S. industry to expand domestic production of batteries. So I want to thank you so much for introducing this bill. It's a great idea. My amendment would add a requirement that the Secretary of Homeland Security be required to submit a report within 180 days, 6 months, which is long before your bill would take place, on the anticipated impacts to DHS's mission and the costs associated with carrying out this bill. The report must include information on the mission and cost impacts to CBP, including the Border Patrol, ICE, including Homeland Security investigations, the Secret Service, TSA, the Coast Guard, FEMA, and other key components within DHS. When it comes to ensuring that DHS purchases support our national security and economic advantage, Democrats and Republicans agree. This is something that we must be doing. So while, again, very much like the concept of Mr. Jimenez's bill, what's missing from the bill is what concerns me, and I'm just suggesting this one addition. We need to have the DHS do a report on how this prohibition of Chinese-made batteries will impact the DHS budget and its mission. Is the DHS currently purchasing batteries that would be banned by the bill? If so, what's it using them for? Do those batteries, in fact, pose a threat? For example, malware from the Xinjiang region, the different things that Mr. Jimenez enumerated. Can the DHS source a sufficient number of batteries from other suppliers if needed? What's the cost difference between a battery made in China and a battery made in the US or by an allied nation? How will DHS fund such a cost difference? How could this bill impact planned DHS initiatives? We don't know the answer to these questions. So my amendment would help DHS to figure out these things before the prohibition actually goes into effect. That gives us here in Congress a chance to help DHS transition to these non-Chinese made batteries, which we all seek that objective, by addressing any unanticipated negative impacts. For example, we could use the report to figure out where they could get the funds to pay for higher cost batteries if necessary. Or we could give the DHS flexibility, and I know your waiver does that also in many ways, to exempt certain agencies if critical operations are going to be impacted. And I know the last thing that anybody on this committee wants to do is to have an unfunded mandate that we can't actually implement. So I urge my colleagues to add this amendment to the bill. With that, I thank the chair and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment to the amendment, the nature of a substitute? Mr. Jimenez, you are recognized.
I do not support the amendment to the amendment. We've already asked TSA and DHS to give us a report outlining any issues they may have or any impact that my legislation would create for them.
Mr. Chairman, could I find out where we could see a copy of that so we can read that?
So the question would be, would the gentleman yield? And the answer is yes. So go ahead, Mr. Swazi.
Committee staff is engaged with DHS on this issue, and you can see whatever they're producing. Yes.
Yes, if you have some sort of report or something like that they gave.
We're waiting for the report to come back. So we've asked for this information, and we're waiting for that to come back. And we'll be happy to share that information with you.
Yeah, so should we wait until we get the report before we vote on this, or should we just add my amendment, which you're getting a report like this anyway, so that my amendment would just require that they do what you're asking for already, and that way we'll be required that they give us that report before it actually becomes enacted.
Let's start the clock on this, and I will allow Mr. Jimenez, the time is it's yielded to you. You're asking him, so you're yielding back for him to answer. Go ahead, Mr. Jimenez.
I think we just need to move forward with this legislation, to be honest with you. You're asking for something we already asked for, but we need to move forward with this legislation. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I recognize Mr. Luttrell for 5 minutes.
Does committee staff have a timeline on when that report is due, like a hard date by chance?
Stand by.
Is it inside the 180 days that Mr. Swazi is asking for, or is it post 180?
The gentleman yields to Mr. Jimenez.
The reports from staff is that we'll get it back before the 180 days.
The gentleman yields to Mr. Swazi.
Will the gentleman yield? Yes. Yeah. I'm just requesting that we do an amendment that requires the DHS to give the report that you guys are waiting for so that we can actually have this information before the bill is actually implemented. That's, I mean, it's kind of the same thing. We're kind of saying the same thing. It's not, I don't even know that this is worth fighting for. I'm asking for a report that answers the exact questions that you've asked for. That's all.
So the time is Mr. Luttrell's.
So in my opinion, this makes sense to me because as hard as it is for us to get reports back from DHS, that puts a hard date on it.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Okay. Does anyone else want to speak on the amendment? Ms. Green, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think we should move forward on a vote on this. I can't imagine anyone on this committee being pro-China or for their battery companies. I think this is a good piece of legislation. Prohibits the Department of Defense from procuring batteries from 6 major companies owned and operated in the People's Republic of China, including Contemporary Amperex Technology Company and Goshen High Tech. I think the bill prohibits the use of DHS funds for purchasing battery technology produced by PRC-aligned Chinese companies. This bill includes waivers if the batteries procured do not pose a national security data or infrastructure risk to the United States, among other requirements. I think the American people have been clear, and we've seen it time and time again. We can't trust China, and China is dominating the world's battery production. And I think this is important for us to move forward. I don't see why we need to.
Point of clarification, though, just if I could, if the gentlelady would yield, we're on the amendment on the report, not on the bill.
Right. I just want to say I think this is such an important national security issue. We can move forward and vote on this. I agree with Mr. Jimenez.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I'm going to recognize myself for just a second. If we put this into this amendment, so we accept Mr. Swazi's amendment, this report demand doesn't begin until this bill becomes law, meaning we have to schedule the floor, we have to pass it on the floor, we have to then send it to the Senate, they have to hear it in committee, then it has to go to the Senate and get passed to the Senate, and assuming it doesn't get amended, and have to go to conference and come back to here, we have a request for them, actually a somewhat of a demand, that they get this information to us. I think this is superfluous, personally. So I'll be against the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I yield. Mr. Swazi, I think you've been recognized already, so what you'll need to, Mr. Magaziner, you're recognized, and I'm assuming you're yielding to Mr. Swazi.
Well, in a second, I'll just say, I mean, this is one of those things where I think people look at us and kind of wonder what's going on here. I mean, it's a very reasonable amendment asking for this information. It in no way would slow down the implementation of the bill should it be passed, and I want to highlight that, as Mr. Swazi said. And if what we're saying is, you know, we already asked for some of the information, so we don't need to ask for it again, well, I appreciate that our colleagues across the aisle are expressing so much confidence in the DHS leadership, and I agree with that. But why not put a deadline on it, right? So what are we even doing here? And with that, Mr. Swazi, if you'd like me to yield, I'm happy.
Mr. Swazi is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. You know, I don't disagree with anything, and this is it's hard for me to say, but that Congresswoman Green said, and I don't disagree with anything Mr. Jimenez said, and I don't disagree with anything the chairman has said. This bill, under the current construction, is not implemented until 2027. So all the talk about the delay, it doesn't take effect until 2027. I'm just asking that the DHS give us a report as the impacts of how this will be implemented. Mr. Jimenez is a former mayor of a major county in the United States of America, larger than most states. He knows what it's like to run a big, complex agency. Getting a report like this written will just help with the implementation of it. I don't need to debate it any further. I don't see why we're arguing about this. It's a pretty straightforward thing, an easy way to get us on your team. So I I don't need to debate any further. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields, Mr. Magaziner. The time is still yours.
I'll yield.
The gentleman yields. I recognize Mr. Swalwell for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, I appreciate the chairman's intent here. I have recently successfully put language into the FAA reauthorization, which essentially bans any of our airports using their funds, federal funds, for their transportation or infrastructure projects that would be sourced from China. I've written legislation that's bipartisan with Mr. Reschenthaler that creates a production tax credit in the area of critical minerals so that we can compete and counter China's illegal practices in this area. I support the amendment here because knowing law enforcement's concerns about this, I want to make sure we understand the impact. And we see this locally in the drone space, Mr. Chairman, where, again, because we're behind on drone manufacturing and the materials needed for drones, our law enforcement still have search and rescue and SWAT needs, and so they've procured drones that, unfortunately, the cheapest and only place to find it comes from China. And they would love more than anything to support American-made manufacturers if that was affordable. And so in the NDAA, they are facing a similar challenge there with some legislation that's going to make it hard for them to do their job. And so I think what Mr. Swazi's asking is let's just understand the impact here before, and especially with kind of a 3-year lead before implementation, to make sure that our first responders and those who rely on this technology know what's going to happen. I would also like to just indulge the chairman to enter into the record a letter from the California fire chiefs, and it's actually not in regard to this legislation, but it's a June 11 letter from the California Fire Chiefs Association regarding the NDAA and the Countering Drones Act there. And it raises essentially the same concerns that I raised that we've seen from first responders. So again, I appreciate the intent here. We should do everything we can to counter China, but we just want to understand as we do that, does that limit us and put us in a worse position as we try and keep the borders secure, as we try and keep the homeland secure? And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Higgins, you are recognized.
I appreciate
On the amendment to the amendment.
the amendment to the amendment and the rest of the amendments to the amendment. I'm going to oppose them all. It appeared to be a coordinated effort to obstruct the intent of the underlying bill, which is a well-written bill mandating that the Department of Homeland Security not use money that's appropriated through Congress to buy batteries produced by companies controlled by Communist Chinese Party-run entities. I mean, it is. May I ask my friend and colleague, Mr. Swazi, do you intend if your amendment fails, do you intend to support the underlying bill or not?
The gentleman yields to Mr. Swazi. You're recognized.
Yeah, it's probably I won't support it. I'll have
There you go.
I'll have to think about it, but I just want to make it very clear, Mr. Higgins.
So reclaiming my time.
Let me just, the gentleman yields, so I can just take a comment on what you're saying, Mr. Higgins?
Well, I believe it's
Mr.
my
Higgins,
time.
I don't think I have to prove my...
It is your time. It is Mr. Higgins'
It's my
time.
time.
I didn't yield back. You yielded to me.
He can reclaim if it's his time.
Okay.
Yeah, it's my time. And I'm just saying, my brother, you always give a straight answer. You gave a straight answer just now. I appreciate that. What I'm saying is all these amendments are structured to delay, require a report, contingent upon the certification of the secretary.
Will the gentleman yield?
List maintained in a moment.
Will the gentleman yield?
List maintained by the Department of Homeland, a list. Nothing in the bill can be construed to prohibit the procurement of electric vehicles. Strategy for procuring batteries. Amendment after amendment after amendment after amendment designed to delay the Congress taking action to stop DHS from using federal money to buy Chinese communist batteries. Can we not just agree that we shouldn't be buying communist Chinese batteries? And I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak? You're recognized.
I yield.
Gentlelady yields to Mr. Swazi.
Yeah, I really shouldn't, thank you, gentlelady. I shouldn't have to do this to prove my bona fides. I'm the founder and the chair of the Uyghur Caucus, has tried to expose the abuses of the Chinese Communist Party to America and the world as to what they're doing in their forced labor camps. I was appointed by the Speaker as a member of the Executive Commission on China and have been trying to expose the nefarious actions by the Chinese Communist Party, not only in Xinjiang, but in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan. I'm the first member of the Democratic Party that came out publicly to say that I would support Speaker Johnson in his role as Speaker if he put the bill on the floor to support the Indo-Pacific, because it's such an important part of our strategy that we have to face here. I don't have to prove my bona fides here. The bottom line is we should not be buying Chinese Communist Party batteries. You're absolutely right about that, Mr. Higgins. Nothing in this amendment that I have proposed will delay the implementation of Mr. Jimenez's thoughtful bill in any way whatsoever. The enaction of this bill is for 2027. I'm simply asking that there be a requirement that the DHS prepare a report that talks about what the impacts of this bill will be, so that, like the California fire departments that Mr. Swalwell mentioned, and the Department of Defense has said when seeking a waiver from the Department of Defense regarding batteries for the Department of Defense, said, listen, let's just see how this is going to impact our operations so that we can implement it in a certain way. We've got to get exactly to where Mr. Jimenez is saying. We should not be buying batteries from the Chinese Communist Party or any companies like that. You're right about that. But let's not screw up our law enforcement process, our procedures in the process. Let's have a thoughtful way of doing it. And let's do it together as a team, Democrats and Republicans. It's a simple, straightforward request that does not delay the building in any way, does not hurt the mission that Mr. Jimenez has laid out in his bill whatsoever. And if we had just gotten this report that Mr. Jimenez referenced earlier that we have not gotten yet already, we probably wouldn't even be in this situation. The report that you said, we've asked them for it, but we haven't gotten it yet. If we had that report already, we wouldn't even be in this situation. So I yield back. Thank you very much.
Ms. Ramirez?
And I yield. I yield.
Gentlelady yields.
I yield to the gentleman, Mr. Magazine.
You're out of time, so someone else would need to.
Sorry.
Mr. Carter, you're recognized.
I yield.
The gentleman yields to Mr. Magaziner.
No, I would just suggest that this is a good faith effort by Mr. Swazi at bipartisanship here. And as I've listened to this debate, I have not heard a single argument for why this would not be useful information for us to have and the public to have. I have not heard an argument for how this would delay or obstruct the implementation of the bill. And so, in a Congress that has gained the reputation for being hyper-partisan, this is an opportunity for my friends across the aisle to show that you don't have to be hyper-partisan. You can agree to a bipartisan amendment that is reasonable, that enhances the bill and does not undermine it. And, let's show the public that we're capable of working together on the most basic things. And so I applaud Mr. Swazi at his attempt to introduce a reasonable bipartisan amendment. And, I hope that my friends across the aisle will see this as an opportunity in that vein. And I'll yield back to Mr. Carter.
Gentleman yields.
I yield.
The gentleman, Mr. Carter yields. Would anyone else care to make a comment? Mr. Kennedy, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go on record supporting this amendment to the amendment presented by Mr. Swazi. This is a common sense approach to creating a piece of legislation and making it better. And to me, this is just a simple way to get more information and create an opportunity for us to work together to make this bill one that I believe we can all rally around. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me go on record for the Democrats on the committee that Mr. Swazi's amendment does nothing for the timeline of the bill. It is just information that this committee could benefit from if it had it. That's not required by the current piece of legislation. So if anything, it strengthens the overall piece of legislation. I yield to the gentleman from The rest of the time, gentlemen from New York.
I just want to ask.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Suarez.
Just ask a simple question, Mr. Chairman. Maybe Mr. Jimenez has the answer. Who does the Department of Homeland Security buy batteries from now?
I'm sure they buy batteries from all over the place, and I'm sure they're buying Chinese
Do we know who they buy batteries from?
This prohibits them from buying it from the Communist Chinese
Do
Party.
we know if they do buy
This
batteries?
prohibits them from buying them from
Do
the
we know
people
if they
that
buy
you
batteries
say-
from them now?
This prohibits them from buying them
So
from
no-
the people that you say.
So nobody
are-
knows.
Hold on. I got the floor. No back and forth here. Let's recognize when you're recognized, that's when you speak. And I think Mr. Jimenez was answering the question. Mr. Swazi, and you yield back, and Mr. Swazi, the time is yours right now. Or actually, it's Mr. Thompson's, but you're recognized.
I just
Mr.
want to ask a very simple question, which I think highlights the common sense approach of this bill. Who does the Department of Homeland Security buy batteries from now? I think Mr. Jimenez said they probably buy them from a lot of people. Okay, it would be good to know, are they buying batteries from?
Would the gentleman yield?
Does Yemen?
I mean, would the gentleman,
yes.
the gentleman
Yes.
yielded to me.
Okay.
So if the report came back that they were buying them from China, and we don't want them to buy from China, and we pass a bill that says you can't buy from China, what difference does the report make?
We need to know which companies they're buying them from. Are they from the Xinjiang region? Are they batteries that are being used with malware, as Mr. Jimenez pointed out? Are they batteries that we can't, say they're being used for some piece of technology right now that is essential to the law enforcement mission of DHS. And if we didn't have those batteries available until they get replaced by a U.S. domestic manufacturer or by one of our allies, we don't want to shut down our law enforcement operations. Let's just get a report.
You reclaiming it? Mr. Thompson's reclaiming his time.
The bill, one of the amendments is intended to fix even that problem, Mr. Swazi. The bill says you can't buy from certain companies. It doesn't say you can't buy from Chinese companies like that. So one of the things we're trying to do is fix the bill so we accomplish exactly what we want to do. It lists 6 companies that you can't buy from, but we don't know if those 6 companies are presently being acquired batteries by DHS because we don't have any information. You're trying to get the information with your report, but even when we had it, another amendment we will discuss shortly will say, don't just limit it to these companies you listed in the bill. Let's stop everybody. So there's a way we can strengthen the bill, so if it's all the Chinese companies, we'll do that. But your bill does not say all the Chinese companies. And that's to come a little later with some other amendments. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Strong, who's yielding to Mr. Jimenez.
This bill is a preemptive bill. It forbids us buying batteries from those companies, those PRC companies. So, the question of where they're buying their batteries now, I would assume they're buying batteries from, there's no prohibition of where they buy their batteries from. This prohibits them from buying them from these companies. So, yeah.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes,
I understand this bill was patterned after a Department of Defense bill that was in the NDAA.
Exactly. And it's
Is it correct then that the DOD had certified that these companies were suspicious and therefore they, as the Department of Defense, were not going to buy from these 6 companies?
This bill passed unanimously in the NDAA, bipartisan bill, just almost exactly the same bill.
So it's my understanding then that the Department of Defense has said these 6 companies are bad and therefore we shouldn't buy for the Department of Defense. And what you've done is taken that information and applied it to DHS. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Mr.
I just
Chairman,
wanted to make sure I understood.
I just
So
yield-
these 6 companies have been ruled by the Department of Defense as suspicious and maybe they hadn't found it, but they suspect that they could because of their associations, and therefore the Department of Defense said, we're not buying those. And it passed unanimously, 100% Republican, 100% Democrat, right? And then you said, well, we'll do that for Department of Homeland Security.
Okay, but
That's correct.
Hold on. I yield to Mr. Jimenez.
Yes, this is patterned after the NDAA. It's law right now, and that's all it is, and it's preemptive.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Jimenez, may I?
Does the gentleman yield?
Well, I just find it curious, though, that, I will in a second. I find it curious, though, that after saying how much you care about the Uyghurs, and that this specifically targets a company that's using Uyghur slave labor to produce the batteries, that when my colleague, Mr. Higgins, asked you if you're going to vote for the underlying bill, you said no. Well, I just found that really interesting.
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman
Yes, I will.
yields.
Under the Forced Labor Prevention Act, they should be prohibited already. We don't need this bill. That company should be prohibited. If there are batteries being produced in the Xinjiang region, they should be prohibited under existing law. We don't need to pass another law for that particular company. However, as Mr. Thompson pointed out, this is limited to 6 companies. There could be other companies as well that we should be looking at. In addition, under the Department of Defense bill, that was passed, there was a blanket waiver. The bill provided for a blanket waiver for them not to follow the law because they didn't want it to impact our warfighting capabilities. Same as we wouldn't want to affect our warfighting capabilities, we wouldn't want it to affect our law enforcement or Homeland Security capabilities.
I'll reclaim my time. We worked with DHS on this, on the waiver, and they're fine with the waiver language that we have drafted.
My staff is telling me that will the gentleman yield?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield for a little while, yeah.
Very quickly. My staff is just saying that the DHS requested the full waiver. But again, this is about a 180-day report that will be required to be submitted long before the 2027 implementation of this law. Okay.
Like I said, the DHS...
Gentleman reclaims.
This is not a good
I reclaim the time. Again, DHS, we provided the waiver language, and DHS is fine with the waiver language that we have in the bill.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of the substitute? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swazi. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of the substitute is agreed to. A recorded vote is requested. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on this question are postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 4 to the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by Ms. Ramirez on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a...
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5729. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5729, offered by Mr. Pfluger, to prohibit the use of federal funds to establish a Homeland Intelligence experts group and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of the substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of the substitute.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5729, offered by Mr. Pfluger.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of the substitute should be considered base text for the purpose of the further amendment. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill that would prohibit the use of federal funds to establish a Homeland Intelligence experts group, or any similar group for that matter. In September of last year, DHS established a Homeland Intelligence expert group. This group was allegedly made up of members to advise the Office of Intelligence and Analysis and assist with decision-making and provide outside perspectives on intelligence and counterterrorism. 2 of the so-called experts in this group are John Brennan and James Clapper, who both signed a discredited public statement on October 19, 2020, that incorrectly implied reports of Hunter Biden's political influence peddling were the product of Russian disinformation. The statement was used by multiple media organizations and social media companies to downplay and suppress reports before the 2020 presidential election. Further troubling is the fact that the experts group also included a former Justice Department official, Tashina Gahar, who was extensively involved in the FBI's probe into baseless allegations that President Trump colluded with Russia in the 2016 election. For a group that is supposed to be objective and nonpartisan, DHS stacked this group with individuals who have abused their credentials and prior roles within the federal government to seemingly advance partisan or personal agendas. On May 2nd, DHS agreed that the Homeland Security Intelligence Group's expert group would be wound down following litigation that raised serious concerns that members of the group did not demonstrate objectivity. While this was a step in the right direction, DHS later formed a seemingly rebranded Homeland Intelligence Advisory Board to build upon, quote, build upon the experts group. On June 25th, 2024, Republican members of the committee sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas requesting documents and information regarding this advisory board. And other than a boilerplate letter response, these requests remain to this day outstanding. It's unsurprising that we've been stonewalled by DHS and our requests have gone unanswered, but this is a consistent theme. My common sense legislation simply prohibits the creation of the group or the formation of any group, program, initiative, or any other similar effort that's equivalent to the group within DHS, no matter the administration, that could be used to potentially support political agendas or messaging while being guised as an expert or advisory group. And I'd also add that the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence has included a similar provision in the Intelligence Authorization Act that prohibits federal funds from being obligated or expended to support the expert group or any successor group as well. That similar provision was passed out of the committee. It's imperative that DHS works to address the catastrophic border crisis in which over 10 million immigrants have crossed the border illegally, including almost 400 known or suspected terrorists, or INA's shortcomings to live up to the original purpose that DHS was supposed to have for them. You know, as we sit through these briefs, these threat briefs together, and we hear information, and we go into a SCIF, and as a user of intelligence for over 25 years, who struck targets in enemy territory, it is critical that we get nonpartisan, unbiased, non-politicized, factual intelligence. There is no place in any administration for the politicization of intelligence. The American public is putting their trust in us to go into that SCIF and perform the correct duties to analyze the intelligence that we get. This is common sense, and it's actually, our country depends on it. The safety, the security of our country and every single citizen depends on doing just that. We have to stop any sort of effort to politicize. And if we all believe in that, this is going to be an easy bill to support. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Goldman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my colleague from Texas. There needs to be nonpartisan, apolitical intelligence and expertise that informs all of our executive branch agencies. That's a big part of the reason why Schedule F of Project 2025 is so dangerous, because it would literally remove all nonpartisan experts from the federal government and allow for anyone implementing it to install political lackeys with political viewpoints. The problem with this bill is several-fold. First of all, this group does not exist anymore. So then the question is, why does this bill prohibit it? And that gets to the next point, which it clearly is not intended to prohibit this specific intelligent experts group. It is the grossly generalized language of any similar effort that this bill would also preclude. And I at least appreciate that my colleague from Texas was open about the reason why he is putting forward a bill that would make it more difficult for the Department of Homeland Security to gather expert advice in order to do their jobs. And we've had a lot of testimony in this committee, including from some of these outside groups who work with CISA to ensure that our elections are secure, that the DHS relies very heavily on outside experts. So you want to get to the rub of this, which is that you don't like the letter that 51 former intelligence officials signed in October of 2020, which you misquoted. It did not say that the Hunter Biden laptop or the release of the information about it was Russian disinformation. It said that based on all of their expertise, it had the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And there are lots of very good reasons for that, that I know you choose to ignore. Let's just dig into it for a minute, because who was the source of, it wasn't a laptop, it was actually a hard drive. Who was the source of the hard drive? The source of the hard drive was Rudy Giuliani. And now we know, after there's been declassified information, that Rudy Giuliani was cavorting with known Russian intelligence agents for over a year leading up to that October surprise. So the notion that an intelligence expert, such as the former director of the CIA or the former director of the Office of National Intelligence, would view a selective release by someone cavorting with Russian assets, Russian intelligence agents, to be a hallmark of Russian intelligence is accurate. It's 100% accurate. You just don't like what it said, and you don't like that neutral, objective intelligence officials would read the cavorting and association of Rudy Giuliani with Russian intelligence agents to be an obvious and objective concern about Russian interference in our election, just like they, of course, did in 2016. And so let's go back to this. The other woman, I'm not familiar with her, but you said something about the Russian investigation.
Will the gentleman yield? 10 seconds.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, it's nice that we can have fun. I mean, I do. It is good to have.
Do you have a yielding for a question, or what's your?
But if I wanted to ask you about the definition of "is," as we go back to the hallmarks of Russian disinformation.
All right, I'll reclaim my time. So
the gentleman reclaims.
The interesting thing is that the entire intelligence community has definitively assessed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Are you now saying, Mr. Pfluger, that anyone who has ever signed on to an intelligence determination or assessment that says that Russia interfered in the 2016 election cannot provide any information or expertise to anyone in the federal government because they show signs of political bias? And I'm happy to yield to you to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that this is a personal issue for you here.
No, it's not personal to me.
Previous,
it's personal to
if
the
you're
United
reclaiming,
States.
if you're reclaiming, reclaim.
No, go ahead.
with previous dealings with this issue. But I think you're also in agreement that we shouldn't have politicized intelligence. I just heard you say that for a couple of minutes.
I am.
So
I'll reclaim my time. The problem is you are parroting misinformation and incorrect information to impugn very dignified and respected former members of the intelligence community who have given their careers to this country to protect our country with intelligence, that they carry a tremendous amount of expertise.
So the gentleman's time has expired, and I'm comfortable if someone else wants to yield to him, but as I said at the beginning of the committee today, I'm going to stick to the 5-minute rule because it's a long 21 bill or 20 bill day. So does anyone else wish to comment on the bill? Mr. Carter, you're recognized.
I yield my time, Mr. Coleman.
Mr. Golden, you're recognized.
Oh, thank you. I'll finish up briefly because it's pretty remarkable that this bill is being put forward to prohibit any funding for any outside expertise from former intelligence officials or anyone with expertise to the Department of Homeland Security, which we all know that the department relies heavily upon because of your subjective viewpoint that an assessment that something carries the hallmarks of a Russian intelligence operation is somehow a politicized viewpoint and therefore undermines the credibility of anyone who had signed that letter to be able to give nonpartisan or apolitical intelligence. You are hamstringing the department from trying to receive expert information from those who are public servants and who are experts. And you're basing it on your own political views, not their political views, because you don't like things that they may have said based on their objective experience. And so I just want to note for the record, and I hope this does go into the legislative history, that because this term, similar effort, is so overly vague as to be undefined, that this bill shall not apply to anything other than the Homeland Intelligence Experts Group, and that whatever successor or future group that the Department of Homeland Security would like to convene in order for them to do their jobs better is permitted and should be funded by the Department of Homeland Security, because this is unconstitutionally vague otherwise. And so I want the legislative record to note that this must be interpreted as solely affecting the Homeland Intelligence Experts Group. And I yield back to Mr. Carter. Thank you.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Carter. Gentleman yields.
Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else wish to?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Green, you're recognized.
Yes, I'd like to enter for the record 2 letters that the committee sent to Secretary Mayorkas about this issue. So I'd like to enter both of these into the record.
So ordered.
Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the Russia hoax started with Christopher Steele writing a dossier. No, I do not yield time to you. Writing a dossier.
You know you're wrong, though.
Writing
Say this over and over.
Mr. Goldman, you do not have the floor.
Written by Christopher Steele, paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign and others. This was purely politics to smear Donald Trump in the 2016 election. It was a complete and total lie, propagated by Democrats and the media. Smeared President Trump, leading to the Russia hoax, leading to this lie, and the American people know it. Here's the real issue. People like James Clapper and John Brennan, they should not have their security clearances. They should be revoked and taken away because they no longer work for the government. They go on television and lie about things like the Hunter Biden laptop. They go on television and talk about a letter they've signed with other intelligence community experts lying about the Hunter Biden laptop in order to make the American people believe something that isn't true. They use their title as intelligence community experts, and they use that heavy weight of that title to tell lies to the American people, to persuade people during a presidential election. You want to know where the contents of that laptop came from? Came directly from Hunter Biden, because that was his laptop. And all of the information on that laptop belonged to Hunter Biden. The liars were the 51 intelligence community experts, so-called experts, that signed their name to a lie in order to persuade the American people of such a lie. That's why those people honestly should not have their security clearances anymore. They shouldn't. And, perhaps that's a bill we should consider, Mr. Chairman. I support this bill, and I yield to my friend, Mr. Pfluger.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you to my
Mr.
colleague.
Pfluger.
And just as a point, that laptop has now been entered as evidence as a federal crime by the Justice Department. So let's just get the facts on the table here.
Will you yield?
No, I won't. But and I think it's also a point, Mr. Chairman, to direct our comments to the chair as a matter of our decorum here in the committee room. But this is important. This is important that we get to the heart of the matter, and every American deserves to hear the truth, the facts. And when we have politicized people who, for the purpose and using their security clearances to politically motivate, suppress, or censor information, then there's questions. And that's what this bill addresses. It addresses that very thing. It gets to the heart of our homeland security. There's no room for politicization of intel, period. And that's all it is. It sounds like that you support that. So I look forward to seeing you vote in favor of this. I'll yield back to my friend from Georgia.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields. I recognize Mr. I did hear a female
was
voice.
me.
Mr. Ramirez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague in front of me started with saying we should not be politicizing our time here. But as I'm hearing debate on this particular bill, it is all about politics. I strongly oppose H.R. 5729 because it is a MAGA political stunt that folks would have long-lasting damaging effects on Homeland Security. The bill's language belies what its actual purpose is. You see, the bill, it says that it would defund Homeland Intelligence Experts Group, but as my colleague to my right here said, it no longer exists. But this bill does go far beyond just that. It actually prohibits any federal funding for the establishment of an equivalent group, any program initiative, or any similar effort. And it goes as far as attempting to tie future Congress's hands by prohibiting the authorization of any activities at DHS that are equivalent to activities of the experts group. But see, looking at the legislation, nowhere in the legislation is equivalent group or similar effort defined, nowhere. So this vague, overbroad legislation would prohibit DHS from soliciting and receiving diverse perspectives on Homeland Security intelligence from outside intelligence groups, from civil rights and liberty organizations, from local law enforcement agencies, from state and local governments, from private industry, I can go on. In fact, H.R. 5729 would prevent the very people and the organizations that DHS aims to protect from weighing in on DHS intelligence activities. Mr. Chairman, I don't know about you, but I want DHS to have the ability to actually engage with people and organizations outside the federal government without regard to politics, so that the people and the organizations DHS serves can actually have a voice on what DHS is doing. This bill, it's the opposite. For that reason, I oppose H.R. 5729, and I give the remaining of my time, I yield it back to Mr. Goldman.
Thank you very much, and fully agree with everything you just said. I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to clarify some blatantly false statements from my colleagues, which not only were once again reiterated in this committee room, but have been pervasive and persistent for many years now. First of all, let's talk about evidence, which my colleague from Texas brought up. That is correct. The laptop belonging to Hunter Biden was admitted into evidence in a trial. That is a different piece of technology than the one that was provided to the New York Post. And if you don't believe me, you can ask the former New York Post writer who testified before the Weaponization Subcommittee, who acknowledged that she received a hard drive, not the laptop, a hard drive from Rudy Giuliani. And it doesn't take a computer expert to understand that hard drives can be manipulated. So if your point is to say that because the Hunter Biden laptop was introduced into evidence in a trial, that therefore whatever Rudy Giuliani had was legitimate, you're sorely mistaken and completely wrong. I also would just like to briefly address one thing, because it's impossible to address everything that my colleague from Georgia said. The Russia investigation very clearly started from a tip from an Australian diplomat to the FBI about a conversation that he had with someone who was involved in Donald Trump's campaign. You like to lump in the Christopher Steele dossier as if that had anything to do with the origination of the actual Russia election interference investigation. It did not. It did have to do with subsequent FISA warrants, and that has been the subject of an intelligence committee, but that had absolutely nothing to do with the investigation that led Special Counsel Mueller to conclude that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, the Trump campaign knew it, and the Trump campaign welcomed that interference and used it for its purpose. So the Steele dossier has nothing to do with that investigation. Let's be very clear about that. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
That's. Thank you. And I just want to set the record straight because there's been some misinformation here. The Hunter Biden laptop, the reason somebody had it was because he failed to pick it up. And there was a copy of the hard drive of the laptop was given to the New York Post. That story was published. And at the time, a senior Biden administration or Biden campaign official by the name of Anthony Blinken, he called an individual by the name of Michael Morrell, who was a former deputy director of the CIA. He asked to help draft a letter that urged the intelligence community to be vigilant about Russian disinformation during the 2020 election. Now, they signed it, and they signed it with saying that this had all the earmarks or hallmarks of hallmarks, really should have said hallmarks, of Russian disinformation. This story about Hunter Biden and his laptop. All the while, they knew that the information was actually true. Because, I'm not going to yield, okay? Because they knew that they had a copy of of Biden's laptop. The New York Post had already written about it, and it was done 2 days prior to a presidential debate in order to give President Biden cover that he took out and said 51 intelligence officers said that this is misinformation.
Will you yield for a question?
No, I won't.
Just for a question.
No, I'm not. Okay, so don't ask again, okay? That this is misinformation, all right? So the only people that really interfered in our election, because later, when asked, a poll was taken about, hey, had you known that the Hunter Biden laptop information was real, would you have changed your vote? A good number, enough to overturn that election, said they would. So the only people that really interfered in our election were the supposedly, trusted experts of the intelligence community that lied to the American people. Not directly, very, very smart. Like I said, had all the hallmarks of. And that was used by the technology companies like Twitter at the time, Facebook, to subvert and basically destroy that story, which was true all along. And not one thing that the New York Post has ever written about what was in that laptop has ever been disputed as being false. Not one thing. After now we know that we have the Hunter Biden laptop. So good trying to change history, okay? But history has a way of coming back and biting you, just like it's doing right now. Because that's exactly what happened, and that's the truth. And by the way, at the end, I still have some time? Great, okay. At the end, the only party, the only people that actually paid Russians to lie and put false information into the Steele dossier was the Clinton campaign and the DNC, who by the way, tried to wash that payment through a legal firm, and then they were fined by the FEC for doing that to the tune of about $500,000. All right? So the only people trying to really fool the American people, are sitting on that side of the aisle right now. Thank you.
Will you yield now?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield my remaining time to you.
Thank you. I'd like to enter for the record an article dated March 17th, 2022, 2 years after the 2020 election, where 51 intelligence community so-called experts lied to the American people saying the Hunter Biden laptop wasn't real. The New York Times belatedly admits the emails on Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop are real and newsworthy. That would have been great information for the American people in the election of 2020. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to introduce for the record another article dated March 30th, 2022, after 51 intelligence community experts lied to the American people in 2020. This one is titled, Washington Post Joins New York Times in Finally Admitting Emails from Hunter Biden Laptop Are Real. I'd like to enter those for the record, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I yield back.
Without objection, both will be entered into the record. Would like to remind all members to please direct their comments to the chair and not to other members here. I will be happy to receive those comments. Do any other members wish to speak? Ms. Clark, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you to my colleague from my next door neighbor in New York. I'm not going to belabor this. It's been belabored for 8 years. I will point out one fundamental flaw in my friend from Florida's recitation of what transpired. These were 51 former officials who did not have access to the FBI's evidence files and could not have had any. Do you need to, can you just listen? And who could not have had access and so would not have known whether or not there was a real laptop or whether it was compared. And that's why the fact is that when they said these are hallmarks of Russian intelligence operation, they were speaking based on their expertise of being longtime public servants, intelligence officials who have dealt directly with Russian intelligence and their efforts not only to interfere in the 2016 election, but going back decades. So I know my colleagues like to throw around the idea that they lied. They had no information to the contrary because only the FBI had the laptop in its custody and nobody else had the laptop. And as many people acknowledge, I'm sure even my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would acknowledge, hard drives can be tampered with. So the fact that there was information on the laptop does not mean that that information remains untampered on a hard drive. So let's just get this straight, because ultimately what this bill is about is a retributive effort by the Republicans to punish intelligence experts who don't share their view of politics and policy, but who used their expert judgment in an objective way with the necessary and proper qualifiers, and in no way, shape, or form lied under any definition of that word, except for the completely perverse definition that I guess my colleague from Georgia seems to have. But let's call a spade here, because you are essentially trying to make sure that the Department of Homeland Security does not have access to expert information in order to keep our homeland safe. And you're doing that because of a misunderstanding and misrepresentation about what you would like to have as revisionist history, that some of those experts actually, opinions that those experts actually made. And it is truly a shame that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are falling prey to this really ugly and political discourse that is having a dramatic and would have a dramatic impact on the Department of Homeland Security actually keeping our homeland safe. Ms. Clark, I'll yield back unless.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's interesting that my colleague from New York, Mr. Goldman, just argued that they had no evidence to the contrary because the FBI had the laptop. If they had no evidence, Mr. Chairman, then why did they feel it necessary to release this letter without having all the evidence? Normally, that's pretty common when you're investigating something. And I think Mr. Jimenez, my colleague from Florida, pointed out exactly why they did it, because they were scared to death that this evidence that had been released, regardless of who it was from, was true. And if it was true and the American people found out about Hunter Biden and everything that he was up to, would have voted differently. And polls showed that post-election. All
You
right?
voted differently for Hunter Biden?
Sir, I haven't yielded my time. Thank you. If you could respect that, I respected while you were talking. My colleague talks about the fact that he doesn't like, my colleague from New York talks about the fact that he doesn't like, or that we don't like, that this information came from Rudy Giuliani. But what he's not telling you is what he doesn't like is that now, after we're close to 4 years removed from this, everybody knows that the Hunter Biden laptop is in fact true. He can make every argument in the world, but we all know it's true. And here's the thing. When I hear some of my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, talk about, oh, we don't want Homeland Security working with experts or outside sources, this bill is not going to stop that. Law enforcement and DHS will continue to use experts and outside sources. What this bill does is stop DHS and the American people from funding an experts group. So I want to make that really clear. We're going to continue to use experts. Law enforcement will continue to use experts, sources, people who are giving them information. It's not going to stop that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
I actually would like to get back to the bill. The Hunter Biden thing kind of distracts from what I think is the original intent. In reading this legislation, I want to figure out the purpose. The purpose is, as Mr. Crane referenced, it talks about specific information advisory committee, expert committees. I'm convinced that when you prohibit an agency from having that kind of access to information, you make us vulnerable. And I would hope the gentleman in making this bill will want to keep us safe. I think any secretary should have access to all the experts available on any given subject. And I would encourage this committee to prohibit that makes us vulnerable as a country, but also it limits whoever the secretary is from doing his or her job. My understanding is that the Homeland Intelligence Advisory Board is basically a forum for DHS to get input from a variety of communities, including intelligence experts, Homeland Security experts, private and civil liberties folk, and all this. I don't see us saying you don't need to talk to these kind of people because their mission is to keep us safe from foreign and domestic challenges. And I don't know how you can do it without talking to people. So I'm inclined to think that we want the federal government to hear all the diverse views possible and then make a rational decision on the information collected. So from my perspective, I'll be voting no on the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the assertion that there's somehow a personal motivation to make our country less secure is ludicrous. Like, that's absolutely ludicrous. And I know some in this room are new to intelligence and going into the SCIF and receiving these briefs. But we're not talking about diverse views, we're talking about facts. That's all that matters, are the facts. I'd actually like to work, my colleague from New York mentioned that the 51 folks that signed this letter had no access to the FBI files prior to signing this letter. That they had no access to the facts, is what I heard him say, that they could not have known, and I quote, they could not have known. I think that's exactly the reason that we're concerned. Because they could not have known. And actually, I would like to work with my colleague from New York on something. If we're so sure that this group of experts was right, why don't we ask them to come take a polygraph on their letter? And let's just set the record straight for once and all. Let's ask them to take a polygraph about that letter, because that is actually a requirement when you have access to classified information. You submit yourself willingly with a non-disclosure agreement that says you won't talk about classified information, and that you submit yourself willingly to a polygraph. Anybody who's had access to classified information in any other agency in this federal government has signed that letter. I've signed it. Everybody else has signed it. Let's ask that group of 51 people, will you work with me on that? Will you ask them to come take a polygraph on this issue? I yield.
Will the
Thank you. Would
gentleman
you yield?
yield?
Thank you. Just to follow up on that.
I just wanted, will you work with me to ask them to do a polygraph?
You know they've all testified under oath to the
That's not the question I'm asking.
Judiciary Committee.
That's not the question.
Mr. Chairman, I
Okay.
reclaim my
Point of
time.
order, claim, the gentleman from Texas has
Pull this thing
reclaimed his
back
time.
on, just pull this thing back on the rails. Mr. Fleury, are you done?
Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from Texas controls the time.
Mr. Goldman, I'll yield to you, and then I'll reclaim it. So use it wisely, please.
Gentlemen, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just want to be very clear. They made an expert assessment based on their training and experience and the facts that they knew. They did not say this information is false. They said it had the hallmarks of Russian disinformation campaign. So I don't know, I'm happy for them to come into polygraph. I don't really care. I'm sure they would say the same thing, which is not that they said, we are right, we are wrong. It was flagging an issue in the election after Russia had done the exact same thing.
Mr. Chairman.
And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Ms. Green?
Thank you. I'd like to tell the committee there's important information to know about this advisory board, DHS advisory board. Members on the advisory board are highly political. Frances Taylor, a former Obama administration, made at least 650 political contributions, totaling over $32,000, all to the Democrat Party or Democrat candidates for office. Asha George, Rajesh Day, Karen Wagner, Elisa Massimo, they also made a combined total of 179 political contributions, totaling $60,000 exclusively to Democrat candidates for political office. I definitely support this bill. No federal funds should establish a Homeland Intelligence expert group filled with people that are highly political. So much so, they're not just political in their voting record, which is private. They're political with their funds. And they do it openly by supporting the Democrat Party and Democrat candidates. I don't think this is good. We've seen it with the intelligence community signing their name to a lie, and they knew it was a lie. 51 intelligence officials lied about the Hunter Biden laptop, and we saw the Democrats lie about the Russia hoax. Thank you. I yield back.
Yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman.
Latrell, will you yield for 5 seconds to me? 10 seconds, whatever you have left.
Yes, sir, Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you. The point is that the origin of that letter is purely political. It came from the Biden campaign. Mr. Blinken was working for the Biden campaign, and he asked a senior intelligence official to help him draft it and have people sign it. And since they didn't know if it was true or not, they should have never signed it because they didn't know if it was true or not. That came out of your own mouth, all right? So it was purely political act, and that's what we're trying to stop right now. Thank you.
We're actually trying to stop interference in our elections. That's what we're trying to stop.
Come on, hey, Dan.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Gentleman is recognized.
I just want to join the ranking member in sort of getting back to the text of this bill. This would be a complete ban on funding any type of advisory group. And so, Mr. Pfluger, do you believe that it's important for executive level officials to be able to engage and get the insights of state and local governments and private industry? And so I would yield to you because I think that's critically important.
No, thank you for
if
that.
you think that's valuable.
No, I think it's very important to have the facts discussed. It's very important. This bill prohibits the funding, and this is the difference. It's very important, and I never walked into an intelligence brief where we had an outside group that was telling us about the threat we were going to face that wasn't particularly vetted by the experts.
I just want to because you sort of keep making that distinction when we go down the SCIF, and that's a particular classified setting for this, right? And this is the ability of DHS to engage with external stakeholders in a variety of different conversations, and how you sort of have framed this bill about the predecessor and then any future, right, advisory group means that it's really going to tie the hands of this DHS, the next DHS, and any DHS moving forward. And to me, why would we do that, to the ranking member's point, when we seem to all be in agreement that it's really helpful to get these external parties? And if you think it's important, then you need to be able to appropriate money, and any money appropriated to DHS to be used in furtherance of an advisory group that seeks these opinions.
Will you yield for a second?
I yield.
Yeah, I'd like to work with you in future Congresses on our oversight.
Yeah.
And if you'd allow me to enter this into the record.
Only if it's good stuff.
It's good stuff. This is the HPSI bill that basically says that it's the same language. Yeah. Mr. Chairman?
Without objection.
I'd like to work with you because I think our job is oversight regardless of political party. That's what this bill is about, is let's hit the reset button. In our opinion, and you may disagree, I agree with Mr. Jimenez. This was a political maneuver. We want to hit the reset button to get back to intelligence. We're not okay with this. My constituents aren't okay with it. We want to hit the reset button so we have good, factual intelligence that keeps our country safe.
And I think the oversight function is exactly what you're trying to get at, right? And totally understand, and you can have your viewpoint, which may differ from Mr. Goldman's, from other colleagues, et cetera. That's entirely fine. But this bill goes so far beyond what you're trying to achieve when we all seem to be in agreement that connecting the federal executive branches with outside voices is critically important. If we think it's important, then we need to be able to fund it. And so I think, I understand you may be frustrated, I understand you may be upset with what happened, but to say and tie DHS's hands when they have such a critically important mission, why this committee is so important, and they will not have the ability, and if they use any money appropriated to them to anything that looks like that, we're gonna have a problem. And so I think we can better achieve what you're looking for, not by this bill, but by other pursuits. I yield.
Mr. Mendes,
It's trust.
Yeah.
We don't trust. My constituents don't trust. They're demanding a reset. They just don't trust. This bill hits the reset button to get the trust back, to restore trust.
And we can go back and forth. I know the lies and liars has been used a lot. It's not for me. But that's also what political elections are for, if people don't have trust, right? And we're supposed to legislate and uplift and the work that our professionals do at DHS, no matter what the administration is, right? And we have oversight of it, and we're supposed to exercise that oversight function, right? But if there's a lack of trust, I believe that belongs to the American voters to elect a new president. That being said, if we are gonna use lies and liars and accuse people across the aisle back and forth, be very careful. Be very careful, because Mr. Jimenez says history comes back to bite you. Do you think the former president has been truthful with the American people from the time that he ran in 2016 to date? Because if you don't, then be very careful of who you accuse to be a liar. And I would just leave it there. I yield to Dan Goldman.
I want to flag one thing on that, just to follow on what Mr. Menendez said, that I think is very important. And I think that this notion that, oh, my constituents tell me this, the constituents tell you things that you have fomented. And they react to the partisanship that they are hearing. And I think we all need to be very, very careful, whether we're talking about the First Amendment or otherwise, of determining that someone has political bias that they cannot leave at the door, and that they are incapable of ever being nonpartisan if they have given a donation to a political candidate. That is going to nullify a lot of expert people from any nonpartisan job, and I think we need to be very careful about that. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman's time has expired. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? The chair recognizes the member from the great state of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman. Just 2 points. First, let's not mistake the fact that foreign actors, including Russia, have tried and are continuing to try to influence our elections. It's not a conspiracy, it's not a hoax, it is real. It is the opinion of the intelligence community, the Department of Justice. In fact, just recently, the Department of Justice has put out arrest warrants against both U.S. and Russian individuals for attempting to influence our elections. And we do a grave disservice to the people we represent if we try to deny it or downplay it just because we think that those foreign actors might help our preferred candidate. But separate and apart from all of that, I want to again reinforce what Ranking Member Thompson said, which is that even if you disagree or even if you're okay with foreign actors trying to influence American elections or sow division or turn Americans against each other, the language of this bill is very broad. It would ban funding for any Homeland Intelligence experts group and doesn't even really define what a Homeland Intelligence experts group is. So is it to be read as you can't convene a group of industry experts to advise the Department of Homeland Security on any intelligence matter? We talk a lot in this committee about the importance of getting ahead of artificial intelligence, about the importance of getting ahead of quantum computing and other methods of modernizing DHS. Certainly, we will need advice from the private sector on how to do that. Certainly, we should be working collaboratively with the private sector to make the homeland more secure. And to suggest that we shouldn't do it because some of the individuals in an advisory group might have political opinions that match those of their administration, well, geez. I mean, I would guess that most people on advisory committees in a Republican administration are Republicans. Hopefully not all. Hopefully you want a diversity of opinions, but I would guess that most of them would be Republicans. And in a Democratic administration, I would guess that many of them would be Democrats. That's why we have elections. So listen, there's a lot to unpack here, but at the very least, as Ranking Member Thompson has suggested and others have echoed, the language in this bill as it is written appears to be so broad and the definitions are so vague that it could be read as to ban all kinds of interactions with experts that may help make our homeland more secure. So without belaboring it, I would encourage my friend, the sponsor, and others to maybe go back to the drawing board, refine this, be more specific about it, because the language is very broad as I read it, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendments in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, the question is now on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Pfluger. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed, please signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 5729, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All opposed, please signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chair,
The ranking member is recognized.
ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed. Chair now moves to H.R. 9731. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 9731. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall please designate the bill.
H.R. 9731, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia, to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to publish on a monthly basis the number of special interest aliens encountered attempting to unlawfully enter the United States and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Ms. Green for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 9731, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for the purpose of further amendment. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since being appointed as border czar, Kamala Harris has undoubtedly been a complete failure in her job and has destroyed our country by releasing record-setting levels of criminals, murderers, rapists, and terrorists into our communities. Border czar Kamala Harris said, "Do not come," yet proudly welcomed over 12 million illegals from over 170 nations and territories, including over 2 million known gotaways who completely evaded U.S. authorities. Included in this 12 million are special interest aliens, also known as SIAs. Special interest aliens are individuals who pose a potential national security risk to the United States, typically from a nation that promotes terrorist activity or harbors terrorists. Under the Biden-Harris administration, there have been at least 73,000 special interest aliens arrested at our border. This does not include the potential SIAs among the 2 million known gotaways who weren't arrested and are now roaming American communities. I say at least 73,000 because the truth is that we do not know the current number since DHS does not publicly release it anywhere. In fact, the only reason we even have this number is because it was leaked to the press. Shocking that that's the only way Americans know. I'd like to remind everyone, it only took 19 terrorists to kill close to 3,000 Americans on 9/11 and wound more than 6,000 Americans. And to get an idea what 73,000 people look like, here is the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. This holds 71,000 people. 73,000, and we have no idea how many more, is how many special interest aliens are in the United States, and DHS does not report it. After 20 years of the U.S. fighting the war on terror, imagine how many terrorists would like to get back at the United States. The American people deserve to know how many and from which countries these potential terrorists are coming from, which is exactly what my bill will do. According to the former chief Border Patrol agent for the San Diego sector, prior to the Biden-Harris administration, the sector averaged only 10 to 15 SIA arrests per year. He testified, once word was out that the border was far easier to cross, San Diego went to over 100 SIAs in 2022, well over that in 2023, and even more than that this year. The number of special interest aliens has skyrocketed, and even more egregiously, this administration has tried to cover it up. The administration of Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Secretary Mayorkas told the chief Border Patrol agent that he was prohibited from releasing any of this information on the increase in SIAs or mention any of the arrests. Prohibited. The administration was trying to convince the public that there was no threat at the border. They are complicit in covering up the complete invasion at our border. My bill would require DHS to publish on their website each month the number of SIA encounters and countries of origin. The American people deserve to know the number of potential terrorists Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have allowed to come into the United States. After all, the American people are the taxpayers. They pay to fund DHS and everyone that works inside the entire department. They fund the government, and they have the right to know who is coming across their border, if they're terrorists or not, and which countries they come from. I urge the committee to pass my bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Do any other members wish to be recognized?
Chairman.
Recognize the gentlelady from the great state of Illinois.
Thank you. It is a great state indeed. Thank you, Chairman. Look, this bill is another play to stoke fear and push all the anti-immigrant rhetoric right before the election. I mean, let's make no mistake, this is the last committee hearing we're gonna have before the election. But this bill will do nothing to improve national security. In fact, it would be giving bad actors real-time information about enhanced screenings our law enforcement is conducting, and this legislation would actually make our communities less safe. Rep. Green's bill would require CBP to publish sensitive national security information every single month. Essentially, it would be giving bad actors around the world real-time updates, folks, on DHS operations and intelligence reporting. This bill isn't about security. Last week at a full committee hearing, Republicans actually argued that Democrats were being misleading on border issues while trying to use some chart that had mistakes left and right, misinformation everywhere. I guess they believe that facts and statistics, let me say it again, are misleading. This is all to shield from the fact that this do-nothing Congress under Republican leadership has been the least effective, folks, since the Civil War. Is it any surprise that today, the last day we're in session, before the November election, that Republicans are bringing 20 bills to markup? Folks, there's no coincidence. Up until today, we've considered very, very little legislation, trust me. No one is fooled by today's actions. And it's been painfully misleading to listen to my Republican colleagues bash immigrants at every single opportunity they get. They've called them terrorists, criminals, freeloaders, other things that I won't mention that my colleagues here call them. They've spread dangerous lies around racist narratives about migrants that have affected our communities and our constituents. But folks, it's also misleading that Republicans have blamed the administration at every turn for an increase in fentanyl and a crisis at our southern border. And then up until really today, they've pretty much blocked any attempts to seriously legislate. Republicans can say that they're taking action to help people. But folks, the American people clearly see the inaction of this Congress. You can't get the votes. We're leaving today on a CR because you can't get your votes. I believe we should be taking up measures in this committee that actually help our communities. Measures like HR 1643, the New Deal for New Americans Act, which helps immigrants and refugees thrive, integrate safely, and contribute to our community. There are so many bills that we should be working on, but what we're doing here is actually helping terrorists get information to make our country less safe in Homeland Security. So this bill, all it does, folks, let me make sure that you hear this. All that this bill does, that the gentle lady from Georgia has introduced, is tip off terrorists by providing them the information to help skirt out security measures. And while doing that, she of course has to make sure that we stoke fears about immigrants in the process. This is a horrible, scary bill, folks. I oppose it, and I encourage the rest of us, if for no other reason, for the security of this country, to also oppose it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a co-sponsor of this bill, and I appreciate my colleague, Congresswoman Green, for bringing it forward. My Democrat colleague, whom I respect, has stated that Republicans are attempting to promote fear with this legislation. Just clarify for America, all this legislation does is require the Department of Homeland Security to publish the number of special interest aliens that they've encountered at the border. How many of these identified illegals that meet a particular description of a travel pattern It's been clearly identified by past administrations before the Trump administration. SIAs were clearly described and identified. Meet a particular travel pattern that's suspicious. It's crossed the level of the threshold of reasonable suspicion. Like this is a special interest alien. All Representative Green's bill mandates is very simply for DHS to tell us how many of these guys they've let into our country. Does that sound unreasonable? The good lady said we're promoting fear, then by all means, quell the fear. If you've got control of this thing and it's like no big deal, it's all cool, there's no SIAs coming in, then publish a list and we'll be quiet. We're not promoting fear, we're promoting truth and transparency. Well, something everyone should want to know. How many of these people have come into our country, have been allowed in, and we're dealing with the Department of Homeland Security, in particularly the House impeached Secretary Mayorkas. That's been obstructive regarding release of data. CBP-1 app numbers, estimated getaway numbers, overseas processing of asylum claim numbers, illegals flown directly from overseas into the interior of our country numbers. Again and again and again, this committee has had a great deal of obstruction from DHS, who's given us clear numbers. It's a matter of public record. We've had many official letters requesting data with no response, follow-up letters, subpoenas for information and data. This DHS, this secretary, under this White House, has been quite obstructive to the Homeland Security Committee. So the gentlelady from Georgia has introduced a simple piece of legislation that, quite frankly, all members of this committee should support, mandating that DHS advise Congress and publish the number of special interest aliens that they've allowed into our country. And if it's not a large number, then my Democrat friends should be happy to see that number. I support the bill. I genuinely believe that Republicans and Democrats should support mandated transparency and truth coming from our Department of Homeland Security. I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Florida.
What I find interesting is that this term, special interest alien, was first coined by the Obama administration under Secretary Johnson. And so all we're trying to do is, how many have you encountered? That's it. I don't see why this is fear-mongering or anything. It's just information that is being gathered today and that should be released to the American people. So how many special interest aliens have you encountered at the border? Okay, fine. I mean, I don't see the big deal in this. And again, the term was actually coined by President Obama and his secretary. So I'll yield back.
Reclaim my time. Does the gentlelady, which time did I yield, Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the other gentleman from the great state of Louisiana, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try and steer this back into a nonpartisan discussion, because it's not Republican or Democrat. We're Americans, and we want a safe country. Representative Green's bill would require CBP to publish sensitive national security information every month, essentially giving bad actors around the world real-time updates on DHS's operation and intelligence reporting. DHS has never publicly released these numbers on a regular basis because the numbers are law enforcement sensitive and could give away crucial information to nefarious actors. This bill provides ample opportunities to tip off terrorists by letting them know which nationalities are getting an enhanced screening in real time and exactly where CBP officers and agents have been stopping these migrants. Criminal organizations could use this information to adjust their operations to try to avoid enhanced CBP inspections. It would basically tell the bad guys that they are in one of these countries. They should destroy their passports, get rid of their identification, and lie about their origins when they reach the border. That's not what we want. I think what we want is to make sure that we're giving every opportunity for our intelligence officials to be secure, get information, and block the bad guys. This notion of Republican versus bad guy, Republicans versus Democrats, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, has gone way too far. There's some discussions that we should not care about party. We should care about America. I can say without fear of contradiction that committee Democrats support greater transparency and accountability at DHS, but not at the expense of tipping off the terrorists and criminal organizations who wish to do harm to our country. I think we all agree with that. And some of these discussions and showmanship of one-upping the other to try and get a political point is counterproductive. It gets us nowhere. We should, in this committee, if nowhere else, should be talking about how we can come together to protect the interest of America. And my dear colleague and friend, Mr. Higgins, you're correct. We all do want transparency. But our approach is what we need to modify. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized?
Mr. Carter, sir, can you elaborate how you believe that us getting the information on these individuals, the SIAs, will tip off terrorist organizations?
Sure. Any opportunity that we have, the more people who are involved in getting sensitive information, the greater chances that it will be leaked and that it will get into the hands of people that will be counterproductive for our safety. Anytime we expand that outside of the most significant intelligence leaders, we enhance the chances others to get that information, thus putting our people at risk.
One more question. Mr. Carter, do you feel like the American people deserve to know and would like to know how many SIAs are entering into the U.S.?
I think the American people would like to be safe and would not like to be put in a position to have information that might ultimately put them at greater risk. It's not about knowing. There's a lot of things that the American people don't know. There's a lot of things that are going on when there's investigations that would inhibit the ability to keep our country safe.
I reclaim my time. Thank you, sir. I want to hit that for a second. I don't feel like the American people, for a second, Mr. Chairman, feel like we're doing a good job keeping them safe. They've lost faith in this institution, and quite frankly, in this administration to keep them safe with what's going on at the southern border. I think they want to know how many SIAs are in this country. I think they deserve to know. And I absolutely believe that this committee needs to know as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I think my Democrat colleagues are confused. My bill will not release any type of personal identification of SIA, special interest aliens. And our government already reports known and suspected terrorists. We already report that information to the public. We already report those numbers. Reporting the numbers of special interest aliens monthly and what countries they come from, reporting that to the American people is transparency. This is not political. This does not attack anyone's identity or race. This is about the safety and security of the United States and the American people that pay their taxes to this government and deserve that information. How this is being portrayed by my Democrat colleagues across the aisle is completely wrong. This bill only provides the numbers once a month to the American people of these types of people that have known terrorist ties or have travel patterns through terrorist nations, and the American people deserve that. I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Crane, you control the time. Gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to speak on the amendment? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendment number 2 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Correa. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 9731, offered by Mr. Correa, number 002.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's clear to all of us here that all of us support transparency for the American people, and we must balance transparency with keeping our citizens safe. This bill will require CBP publish sensitive national security information every month, essentially giving the bad actors around the world real-time updates on DHS operations and intelligence reporting. DHS has never publicly released these numbers on a regular basis because these numbers are law enforcement sensitive and could give away crucial information to the bad guys. This bill provides ample opportunities to tip off the bad guys by letting them know what nationalities are getting in enhanced screening. This bill will let people know what nationalities are getting enhanced screening in real time and exactly where CBP officers and agents have been stopping these immigrants. Criminal organizations could use this information to adjust their operations and try to avoid enhanced inspections. And my colleague from Arizona was asking a specific question there, and I can tell you, sir, that this bill requires publications of the countries and the place that the actual encounters are taking place. This essentially will enable the bad guys to figure out where we are placing our resources. All of us support greater transparency and accountability, but not at the expense of tipping off the bad guys and criminal organizations who wish to do this country harm. My amendment essentially inserts a text of Senator Cornyn's Southern Border Transparency Act of 2023. Senator Cornyn's bill just passed the Senate by unanimous consent last week. It's something that all of us can get behind, and it will give the American people more information about what's going on at the border. Senator Cornyn's bill, my amendment, would require that CBP publicly share additional information on migrants who receive parole on a monthly basis. It would also require quarterly detailed public reports on the migrants encountered along the southern border and how CBP processes these cases. This bill would be the first time that DHS is required to publicly report on what happens to migrants after they are encountered by CBP at the border. The public would get to know how many people received and This bill will let people know how many folks are actually received and passed credible fear screenings, as well as to how many migrants were placed in detention, removal, or released into our communities. And none of this information in my amendment puts our national security at risk. If we are serious about our national security, we must be thoughtful about the data we make public. We need to make sure that we are not sharing sensitive information that bad actors could use to do us harm. In essence, the underlying bill will tip off for terrorists as to how to avoid enhanced screening and vetting by CBP. My amendment would keep Americans safe while still forcing DHS to be more transparent with the American public. And let me be clear, DHS has expressed security concerns with this legislation. That's why I'm offering an amendment, Senator Cornyn's bill, that passed the Senate unanimously just last week. And just an FYI to all of us, those 19 individuals that attacked us on 9/11 were not SIAs. They're visa-holding immigrants. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you. To my friend from California, to the committee, I'll say something that's probably going to shock my Republican colleagues here, but I urge everybody to support the language that you are advocating for. However, not in the form of this amendment. This already exists. The language of this amendment already exists. And Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow me, I'd like to enter this into the record, which is kind of strange because it's already in the record. H.R. 6523.
Be admitted without objection.
The amendment that we're considering here, and I totally agree with it, I'm glad to know, but I'm looking at the co-sponsor list, and there's not a single person on this committee on the other side of the aisle. It's a co-sponsor of 6523, which is the exact language of my good friend Mr. Correa's.
Would gentlemen yield?
Sure.
So my good friend from Texas, you've been to the SCIF. I believe we both have been to the targeting center here in Washington, right outside. And all of us signed documents saying you shall not disclose the information on the individuals on that special interest list, where they come from, what they're being targeted for. There's a reason we signed that document, because that's sensitive information that I believe DHS uses to target and protect our country. I'm not sure why we would want to disclose that information. And I would offer...
Lou, let me reclaim my time on it. I agree with the language that you're offering as an amendment, but I think we should do both. That's Ms. Henson's bill. She's the co-sponsor, the companion bill to Cornyn's bill in the Senate. It's 6523. It sounds like everybody's in favor of that. I hope that you will co-sponsor it by the end of the day, because that's already being considered. It was a UC procedure. Not a single Democrat in the Senate objected to it. But let me explain. So I'm glad to know that we're going to have support.
Will you yield?
Let me explain my rationale for SIAs. It took months in this committee to get this administration to release the KSTs, known or suspected terror numbers. And we now know that there were less than 20 in the 4 years that President Trump was president. But we also now know, thanks to the efforts of this committee under the leadership of Chairman Green and the pressure that was applied to the administration, that there are almost 400 people who match the KST list, the known or suspected terror list. When we talk about classified information, I'm glad you brought that up. The reason that we classify certain information, this is classification, these are national security. Classified information is done so to protect sources, tactics, techniques, procedures, and other information that leads you to the sourcing of that material. Law enforcement sensitive, however, is something completely different. But the numbers and even the countries, the American public is screaming for this information. And this is personal to me. This is personal to me. Because over 2 years ago, I had a sheriff call me from Kimball County, Texas, and he said we had a special interest alien, and much to the chagrin of our other colleagues that have said that this is somehow a term of defamation. No, this is not. Department of Homeland Security says that this is a non-U.S. person who, based on analysis of travel patterns, potentially poses a national security risk to the United States or its interest. Our country deserves to know this number and where they are from. I'll give you 20 seconds because I'm going to take back that last minute.
Just all of the above, but understand DHS has concerns with this legislation. I would offer our colleague from Georgia to go back and work with DHS to come up with some language that they can accept.
I'm going to take my time back. You're right, and that's not surprising, and that's the reason that we impeached Mayorkas, because we don't see eye to eye on the security of our country.
You don't trust our men and women in the front lines?
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about,
Yeah, that's
I'm sure
DHS.
It's not surprising. It's not surprising that DHS has a problem with this because the information
No,
is
well-
damning. It's absolutely damning. And we have SIAs coming into this country at a number that is overwhelming us. It is absolutely
We have a worldwide refugee challenge.
Well, the gentleman,
This is an issue for all of us to address, not as DSRs,
The
but
gentleman from Texas.
the American
The
public
gentleman from Texas controls
are
the
relying
time.
us in our good work.
Ms. Cray, the gentleman from Texas controls the time. Thank you. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yield to my colleague from Georgia.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you. I'd actually like to inform you that DHS does not have a problem with this bill. As a matter of fact, they gave input to the committee about this bill and made suggestions, and we added them. So it is a complete falsehood that DHS has a problem with this bill. I yield back, Mr. Pfluger. Thank you.
I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's
You
time.
didn't take all of their suggestions, ma'am. You didn't take all of their suggestions, just some of
The
them.
gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the state of New York, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for this important discussion. I want to thank Congressman Correa for bringing this amendment to the floor. I'm fully supportive of this amendment. It clarifies what we're trying to do here and keep our borders safe. It's bipartisan. It's a strong alternative to what's been proposed that, if not amended, would put our country at risk. And so we need to move forward in a way that increases transparency, increases communication, and does not tip off terrorists around the globe that wish to do us harm. And this is a bipartisan approach. So I think we should take this amendment by Mr. Correa into consideration immediately, vote it up. Let's do it in a bipartisan fashion. I've seen this committee do bipartisan work before. Let's get it done. Thank you.
Does the gentleman yield back? Gentleman yields. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you. I think it's very important to understand that the CBP website already releases the terrorist screening data set. That information is already made available, and that does not hurt our government's ability to locate and track down terrorists. These are numbers. These are numbers. Telling the American people the number of special interest aliens coming across our border and what countries they are from every single month does not hurt our government's ability. It doesn't tell our enemies any information. What it does, it tells the American people what a bad job this government is doing. That's what it's transparency. It tells the taxpayers and the American
this
people
legislation, ma'am.
that, you know what, I support the legislation you're trying to introduce, and I support it separately. But playing politics and trying to cover up for the failures of Secretary Mayorkas and the Biden administration's DHS by introducing an amendment and trying to replace my bill text with another bill is disingenuous, and it shouldn't be done. No, I'm not yet. No, I'm going to keep talking. There's something also important that people need to know. We had a hearing in here, and one of our witnesses, Aaron Heitke, who was a retired chief Border Patrol agent, he quoted simultaneously, in San Diego, we had an exponential increase in special interest aliens. These are aliens with significant ties to terrorism. Prior to this administration, the San Diego sector averaged 10 to 15 SIAs per year, 10 to 15 per year. Once word was out that the border was far easier to cross, San Diego went over 100 SIAs in 2022, way over 100 SIAs in 2023, and more than that this year. These are only the ones we caught. At the same time, I was told I could not release any information on this increase in SIAs or mention any of the arrests. The administration was trying to convince the public that there was no threat at the border. End quote. This is what a retired chief Border Patrol agent said, Aaron Heitke. He said he was told he wasn't allowed to release it to convince the public that there was no problem. That's lying to the American people about the threat that they live under every single day. And introducing an amendment to replace this bill text continues the lie and the cover-up. Lying about the numbers, not names, not the ability, not how they tracked these people down, not how they caught them, not how they arrested them. It's just telling the number. And the American people absolutely deserve that number, at least once a month, from the government that is supposed to protect them. The federal government has a duty to the states, all 50 states, a sworn duty in the Constitution to protect the states from invasion. This government has completely failed to do that. And your amendment, Mr. Correa, is another effort to cover it up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Do any other members wish to be recognized? Mr. Goldman, you wish to be recognized?
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Correa.
To my colleague from Georgia, all of us here are for transparency. Cover-ups don't work. Eventually, you get to the truth. The sooner the better, especially when it pertains to the national defense, security of our citizens in this country. In this situation, ma'am, you took some of the amendments, but not all the amendments or the language that was recommended to you by DHS. All I'm asking is you pull back and let's talk national security. I've been to the targeting center, like all of you, I'm sure, have gone there, to address SIAs and their characteristics and where they come from. I would like to speak more, but I signed a contract that said I cannot disclose. But the bottom line is, what we want to do is come up with some good common sense legislation. Senator Cornyn is moving in that direction. I would say we take the lead and continue to work with him. Love to go back and talk to DHS about what you accepted and what you didn't accept. Always balancing information, transparency with national security. And I have to tell you that I trust our men and women at DHS protecting our country. And they are the ones that make the final decision as to what we should know, what the public should know, and what they need to know to make sure the bad guys don't game us when it comes to deploying our resources at the border or any other places internationally. I want to yield to my colleague, Mr. Carter.
It appears that your obsession is more with Secretary Mayorkas and Biden than it is with safety of the American people. No one is disagreeing that we want to have the information. No one is disagreeing that we want our national security people to go after the bad guys and to make sure that we are following their movement. The difference is you want to put our people, our law enforcement agents, at risk. And to make a point that is a political point to demonstrate your angst or displeasure with Secretary Mayorkas, fine, you have that right. You do not have the right to try to hoodwink the American people into believing that you want to do what's in their best interest when truly what you want to do is to grandstand and to try to further shame someone that you think didn't do a good job. I'm not here to defend Secretary Mayorkas, but we all are here to defend the American people. I yield.
Mr. Carter, you yield back to Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman, you control the remainder of the time.
I do.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to be recognized? The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane.
I just think it's pretty disingenuous. Nobody's trying to, nobody has an obsession with Secretary Mayorkas. Yes, did we want to see him impeached? Absolutely, because of the job that he was doing. But let's be honest, and Mr. Pfluger said it well. One of the reasons for the classifications that we put around things is to protect methods and sources. By releasing the numbers, not the methods at which how we caught them, or the sources that tipped us off or led us to information, we're not releasing any of that information. We're just trying to illuminate the numbers, not only to this committee, but to the people that we're here to represent that have lost trust in our ability to protect them. So, I support, Lou's, my good friend from California, in his efforts. I just don't think it has any part in stripping out the language in Ms. Green's bill. I want to yield some time to my friend from Texas.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman's recognized.
Okay, so that makes, so I see the friction point between the classification levels and the department's sharing of that information. Mr. Crane's statement makes sense to me, so can we have a discussion, please?
Sure. But this this bill also.
I yield to you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you.
I mean,
Ms.
Thank
Latrell,
you, Mr. Latrell. This
let
bill,
me interrupt. Ms. Latrell, you need to yield back to Mr. Crane, and Mr. Crane wishes
Mr. Crane,
to
I
yield,
yield.
and I'm happy to do
I'll
that.
yield 10 seconds to Mr. Correa.
this legislation also requires that you tell them where they were caught. So what you're saying is, you're telling people on a monthly basis where you're targeting, where most of your apprehensions are coming from.
But that doesn't, Mr. Correa, that doesn't divulge method or sources. Just telling people where they were caught does not divulge methods or sources, right?
And Mr. Crane, I guess we're going to disagree on this one because I'd rather go back to the experts, which is DHS, to say, what do you feel good about disclosing? What don't you feel good about disclosing?
Well, Mr. Correa, would you admit that they have a political reason to not want these numbers released because of the increase in numbers of SIAs that are coming in under this administration?
Eli, Congressman Crane, the men and women at our front lines, I don't believe are motivated by politics.
I agree with you, sir. And I think most people on this committee agree with that. We're not concerned with the men and women on the front lines. We're concerned with leadership that is going to take the accountability, and they're going to take the incoming for the rise in SIAs coming through the southern border. That's where we have the problem, sir.
Very quickly, I'd like to invite a couple of you to go with me to the targeting center so you can hear. So you've been, so you know SIAs are not all the same. There's a lot of stuff there. But, you know, how high up to the politics? I'm not defending Mayorkas. I'm defending the frontline folks that are actually doing the job. And I think that's where we have the disagreement. Is this stuff, this information proper to disclose or not? That's really the issue. I'm for disclosure. Ms. Green, I'm with you. I just don't know if this information is proper. That's where I go back to DHS. And we have a question of fact here. My colleague from Georgia says she worked with DHS. Our information is you didn't work completely with DHS. And that's where I think with the question of fact pops up.
Okay, well, I respect you, Mr. Correa. I know we're going to have a difference of opinion here. Mr. Latrell, did you want to say something? Okay, I yield. Ms. Green?
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to enter for the record, Mr. Chairman, a tweet from May 29th, 2024, just some months ago, by Chief Jason Owens, stating U.S. BP agents in Santa Teresa, New Mexico, apprehended 6 special interest migrants, aliens, from Morocco. This is exactly what my bill does.
Without objection, it'll be entered into the record.
Thank you.
You yield back to Mr. Crane. Ms. Crane, she's yielded back to you. You control the
Yes,
time.
I yield back.
Mr. Crane yields back. Any other members wish to speak? The chair recognizes at this time the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that the Correa Amendment, which adopts the Cornyn language, which is already passed, if we pass it, requiring the reporting requirement as listed, then we can move this bill to the floor in short order and have the necessary reporting completed. So I would support the Correa Amendment and the reporting, which is basically the same language that was adopted on the Senate side by the Cronin Amendment. And if you want to say any more about your amendment, Ms. Correa, I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. Do any other members wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, if there's no further debate, the question is agreeing to the amendment and the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Correa. So again, to be clear, this is the amendment to the amendment and the nature of a substitute. With that, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, please, with no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment nature of substitute is not agreed to. Mr. Ranking Member.
ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed.